I watched my own son sneak into my garage and bury a heavy black bag at the bottom of my fishing gear. When I opened it and saw enough narcotics to put me away for the rest of my life, I did not scream. I did not call the police. I just took that bag, walked over to his brand new BMW and shoved it deep into his spare tire compartment. 30 minutes later, when the sirens wailed down my driveway, my son thought he was about to watch me lose everything. He had no idea he had just dug his own grave. Before I tell you how this all went down, let me know in the comments where you are listening from today. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe that respect is earned no matter who you are dealing with. My name is Lloyd Daniels. I am 75 years old. To the outside world, and especially to my son Kendrick and his wife Paige, I am just a tired, retired carpenter living out his final days on a modest pension. They look at my calloused hands and faded flannel shirts and see a man who has outlived his usefulness, a man they can easily step over. What they do not know is that those same hands built a regional construction supply empire back in the 1980s. I secured my wealth in blind trusts decades ago to protect my family from the very greed I am staring at right now. It was a crisp Sunday morning in my neighborhood in Atlanta, the kind of morning where the dew is still heavy on the grass and the world feels perfectly still. I was in the kitchen sipping my black coffee, getting ready for my weekly fishing trip out on the lake. Evelyn, my late wife, used to pack my thermos for me. Since she passed 5 years ago, the house has felt too big and too quiet. But I find my peace. Or at least I try to. Through the kitchen window that looks out into the attached garage, a shadow caught my eye. It was Kendrick. He was moving fast, looking over his shoulder, sweating despite the morning chill. He crept toward my workbench where my old green tackle box sat ready for the day. I watched him pull a black plastic bag from inside his designer jacket. The bag was wrapped tight with thick silver duct tape. He shoved it deep under my fishing lines and extra reels closed the latch and practically ran back into the house. I did not confront him. 40 years of running a cutthroat business taught me that reacting on emotion is how you lose the war. I set my coffee mug down on the counter. My heart was beating a steady rhythm. I walked into the garage, my steps silent on the concrete floor. I opened the tackle box. The smell of old bait and river water hit me, but right there at the bottom was the black bag. It felt heavy, too heavy. I took my pocket knife and carefully sliced a small slit through the duct tape. What I saw inside made my blood run cold. It was not money. It was not stolen jewelry. It was dozens of amber prescription bottles. I pulled one out and read the label. OxyContin, high-milligram pills, hundreds of them. And tucked right next to those bottles was a cheap prepaid cell phone. I turned the screen on. It was not locked. I opened the text messages. They were rigged. Messages from unknown numbers asking for prices, asking for meetups, referring to me as the old man with the supply, my own flesh and blood, the boy I taught how to ride a bike. The boy I put through college was trying to frame me as a major drug distributor. At 75 years old, a charge like this would mean dying in a federal prison. He wanted me locked away forever. Why? The question burned in my mind, but I pushed it aside. The why did not matter right now. The what came next was all that mattered. A lesser man would have marched into the living room and demanded answers. A weaker father would have cried. I did neither. I zipped the bag back up and grabbed a roll of my own duct tape from the workbench, sealing the slit I had made so perfectly that no one would ever know it had been opened. I walked out the side door of the garage and into the driveway. Kendrick had parked his pristine white BMW right behind my old truck. He always bragged about that car. He loved to show off his mid-level finance manager salary while acting like my modest living was a disease he might catch. I popped the trunk. The car was unlocked, which was a careless mistake by a careless man. I lifted the trunk floorboard, exposing the spare tire compartment. It was empty save for a few tools. I took the black bag of narcotics and shoved it deep under the heavy spare tire, wedging it so far back you would have to take the whole trunk apart to find it. I closed the floorboard. I shut the trunk with a soft click. I walked back inside the house, washed my hands at the kitchen sink, and picked up my coffee mug. It was still warm. I took a sip. I could hear Kendrick and his wife Paige walking down the stairs, their voices hushed but tense. I sat down at the kitchen table, picked up the morning newspaper, and waited for the storm to hit. I knew what was coming next. The trap had been set, but the prey had just switched places. Let them play their game. I was ready to play mine. I watched my own son sneak into my garage and bury a heavy black bag at the bottom of my fishing gear. When I opened it and saw enough narcotics to put me away for the rest of my life, I did not scream. I did not call the police. I just took that bag, walked over to his brand new BMW and shoved it deep into his spare tire compartment. 30 minutes later, when the sirens wailed down my driveway, my son thought he was about to watch me lose everything. He had no idea he had just dug his own grave. Before I tell you how this all went down, let me know in the comments where you are listening from today. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe that respect is earned no matter who you are dealing with. My name is Lloyd Daniels. I am 75 years old. To the outside world, and especially to my son Kendrick and his wife Paige, I am just a tired, retired carpenter living out his final days on a modest pension. They look at my calloused hands and faded flannel shirts and see a man who has outlived his usefulness, a man they can easily step over. What they do not know is that those same hands built a regional construction supply empire back in the 1980s. I secured my wealth in blind trust decades ago to protect my family from the very greed I am staring at right now. I took another sip of my coffee. The house was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that comes right before a storm. I could hear Kendrick and Paige upstairs. Their footsteps were heavy and rushed. They were preparing for the show they were about to put on. I turned the page of my Sunday newspaper. I did not actually read the words. I was just watching the clock on the kitchen wall. Tick, tick, tick. It took exactly 30 minutes. The faint wail of sirens started in the distance. At first it was just a low hum blending in with the morning traffic on the main road, but it grew louder, faster, more urgent. Within seconds the sound was deafening, echoing through the quiet suburban streets of our neighborhood. Flashing red and blue lights began to bounce off the walls of my living room, casting wild shadows across the family portraits that hung in the hallway. I heard the harsh screech of heavy tires slamming onto the concrete of my driveway. 2 police cruisers had arrived. Upstairs the performance began. I heard Paige scream. It was a loud, theatrical scream, the kind of sound someone makes when they want an audience. Footsteps pounded down the wooden staircase. Kendrick burst into the kitchen, his face a mask of manufactured terror. He looked at me, his eyes wide, playing the part of the horrified son to perfection. He actually had tears in his eyes. I had to give him credit. If I did not know that he had just tried to frame me for a federal crime, I might have believed he actually cared about me. Paige followed right behind him. She was wearing her expensive silk robe, clutching her chest, letting out small, dramatic sobs. She looked out the window at the police cars and gasped. "Oh my God, Kendrick, what is happening?" she cried out. Her voice was shaking, but I could see the cold calculation in her eyes. She was ready. They were both ready to watch the police drag me away in handcuffs. Loud knocks rattled the front door, heavy, demanding knocks. Police opened the door, a voice shouted from outside. Kendrick rushed to the entryway. He threw the door open, raising his hands in the air to show he was not a threat. "Officer, please come in," he said, his voice trembling with fake emotion. "I am so glad you are here. We did not know what else to do. We are terrified." 2 large officers stepped into the foyer. Their hands were resting near their duty belts. They looked around, their eyes scanning the room until they landed on me. I was still sitting at the kitchen table, holding my coffee mug, looking at them with the calm expression of an old man whose morning had just been rudely interrupted. "What seems to be the problem here?" one of the officers asked. He was a tall man, serious and all business. Kendrick stepped forward, blocking their view of me. He put his hands on his head, acting like a man crushed by the weight of a family tragedy. "It is my father," Officer Kendrick said, his voice breaking perfectly. "His name is Lloyd Daniels. He is 75 years old. He has been living with us, and lately his mind is just gone. He has completely lost his mind." Paige stepped up right beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. She looked at the officers with her big, tear-filled eyes. "We have tried everything to help him," she said softly. "But he is on a fixed income, a tiny carpenter pension. He has been so desperate for money lately. We give him everything we can, but he is just so confused. He does not know what he is doing anymore." The officer frowned, taking out a small notepad. "What exactly has he done, sir?" Kendrick leaned in closer to the officer, lowering his voice as if he were sharing a shameful, heartbreaking secret. "I caught him, officer. I caught him hoarding narcotics. I do not know where he got them from, but I saw him packing them up this morning. He is trying to sell them. He has bottles of OxyContin, hundreds of pills. He is out of his mind, and we were so scared he was going to hurt himself or someone else. I had to call you. I had to protect my family." I sat there listening to every word. The betrayal was so deep it almost felt surreal. My own son was standing in my house, painting me as a senile, desperate, drug-dealing old man. He was using my age and my race against me, knowing exactly how the system views an old black man with a supposed stash of narcotics. He was handing me over to the wolves so he could take whatever he thought I had left. The two officers looked at each other, then walked past Kendrick and approached the kitchen table. Mr. Daniels, the tall officer, said, his tone stern. "We received a report of illicit narcotics on this property. We need to ask you a few questions." I slowly set my coffee mug down. I looked up at them, keeping my face entirely blank. "I do not understand, officer," I said, making my voice sound a little weaker, a little more fragile than usual. "I am just getting ready to go fishing. I have not done anything wrong." Paige let out another fake sob from the hallway. "He does not even know what is going on," she whispered loudly to the other officer. "It is the dementia. It is getting so bad." "Mr. Daniels," the officer continued, ignoring Paige, "your son stated that you have narcotics hidden in your belongings. We are going to need to search your things. Do we have your consent, or do we need to get a warrant?" I looked at Kendrick. He was staring at me, a tiny, almost invisible smirk playing on his lips. He thought he had won. He thought this was the end of my story. "You do not need a warrant, officers," I said calmly. I stood up from the table, moving slowly, playing the part of the cooperative, harmless old man. "I have absolutely nothing to hide. My fishing gear is right out there in the garage. Please go ahead and look. I will show you myself." I walked toward the garage door. The officers followed right behind me. Kendrick and Paige trailed closely behind them, eager to witness the grand finale of their sick little play. We stepped into the cold garage. My green tackle box and my canvas backpack were sitting exactly where I had left them, on the wooden workbench. "There it is," Officer Kendrick said, pointing a shaking finger at the tackle box. "He was putting them in there. I saw him with my own eyes. Just a few minutes ago. A huge black bag full of pills." The tall officer stepped up to the workbench. He put on a pair of blue latex gloves. "Step back, please," he instructed everyone. The garage went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. Paige was holding her breath, waiting for the moment the bag was pulled out. Kendrick shifted his weight from foot to foot, practically vibrating with nervous excitement. The officer popped the metal latches on the tackle box. They clicked loudly in the quiet space. He threw the lid open. He pulled out a tray of colorful fishing lures. He set it aside. He reached into the bottom compartment. He pulled out a spool of clear fishing line. He pulled out a pair of rusted pliers. He pulled out a small plastic container of fresh bait. Then he stopped. He looked into the empty bottom of the tackle box. He moved the remaining tools around, checking the corners. Nothing. He turned to my canvas backpack. He unzipped the main compartment, plunging his gloved hands inside. He pulled out an old thermos, a rain jacket, a crushed map of the local lake. He unzipped every side pocket, shaking the bag upside down. Nothing fell out. The bag was completely empty. The officer stood up straight, taking off his gloves. He turned around and looked directly at Kendrick. His face was hard and unamused. "There is nothing here, sir," the officer said, his voice echoing slightly in the garage. "Just fishing equipment." The color drained from Kendrick's face in an instant. It was as if someone had pulled a plug and let all the blood rush out of his body. He stared at the empty tackle box, his eyes wide with absolute horror. "No," Kendrick stammered, taking a step forward. "No, that is impossible. It was right there. I swear to you it was right there in a black bag. You have to look again. He must have moved it." The officer crossed his arms over his chest. "We just searched the entire area, sir. There are no narcotics. Are you sure you saw what you think you saw?" Kendrick began to sweat. Not just a little sweat. Heavy drops of perspiration formed on his forehead and rolled down his temples. His breathing became shallow and fast. He looked at me, panic flashing in his eyes. He realized the trap was empty, but he did not know how. Paige stopped her fake crying. Her dramatic sobs vanished into thin air. She stood perfectly still, her mouth slightly open, staring at Kendrick in utter confusion. The perfect script they had written had just caught fire and burned to ashes right in front of her eyes. "He is hiding it!" Kendrick yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. "He is hiding it somewhere else. You have to search the whole house. He is crazy. He is a criminal. You have to believe me." I stood perfectly still, watching my son unravel. The silence was heavy. The police officers were losing their patience, staring at a sweating, frantic man who was screaming about drugs that did not exist. The game had completely changed, and Kendrick had no idea what was about to hit him. The garage felt like a tomb. It was so quiet you could hear the dust settling on the concrete floor. Kendrick was breathing hard. His chest heaved up and down beneath his expensive designer shirt. His eyes were darting frantically from the empty green tackle box to my face, and then to the police officers. The tall officer crossed his muscular arms and stared directly at my son. The air in that small space was thick with an unbearable tension. Kendrick kept shaking his head left and right, muttering under his breath that it made absolutely no sense. Paige was completely frozen. She had clearly practiced her role as the grieving, concerned daughter-in-law all morning, but she did not have a backup script for this exact moment. I looked at the two police officers and let out a long, heavy sigh. I hunched my shoulders forward just a little bit to look exactly like a fragile father carrying a heavy emotional burden. I knew exactly how to play this game. I had spent decades sitting in high-stakes boardrooms reading the psychology of ruthless men and manipulating complex negotiations. Dealing with a greedy son and an arrogant daughter-in-law was child's play compared to building a supply empire. I looked at the tall officer and spoke in a soft, steady, and deeply convincing voice. "Officers, I am so incredibly sorry for this confusion," I said slowly, letting my words hang in the heavy air. "I am just an old retired man trying to enjoy my quiet Sunday morning. But I have to be completely honest with you right now. My son has been under a tremendous amount of stress lately, corporate stress. He works in middle management finance and the pressure has been getting to his head." I paused for a brief second and looked at Kendrick with eyes full of fake pity and sorrow. Kendrick opened his mouth to speak, but I kept going, not giving him an inch of breathing room. I hate to say this to strangers, but I have been very worried about his mental state. This morning, right before you arrived, I was looking out my kitchen window. I saw Kendrick stumbling around out there in the driveway. He was acting very erratic and deeply paranoid. He went straight to the trunk of his white BMW. He was shoving something heavy deep inside the trunk, looking nervously over his shoulder the entire time. Kendrick let out a choked gasp that sounded like he was drowning. He took a stumbling step back, his expensive Italian leather loafers scraping harshly against the cold concrete floor. "Dad, what are you doing?" he stammered, his voice shaking with raw fear. "What are you saying right now?" I completely ignored his desperate plea and kept my eyes locked on the police officers. "If you are looking for illicit narcotics, officers, I pray to God my son has not relapsed," I said, my voice cracking with just the right amount of parental devastation. "I do not know what he put in that car, but his behavior has been completely out of control lately." The shift in the room was instant and profound. The two officers turned their heads slowly and locked their intense gazes on Kendrick. The dynamic had completely flipped upside down. Just 10 minutes ago, I was the prime suspect. Now they were looking at a sweating, panicked man in a designer shirt who had very likely just filed a false police report to waste their time. The tall officer took a heavy step toward Kendrick. "Sir, do you mind handing over the keys to your vehicle?" he asked. His tone was no longer polite or accommodating. It was a firm, unyielding order. Kendrick started shaking his head wildly side to side. "No," he shouted, his voice echoing off the garage walls. "No, you absolutely cannot search my car. This is insane. I called you here to search him. He is the one with the drugs. You cannot just search my car because a crazy old man made up a ridiculous story." The second officer rested his hand casually on his utility belt, a clear sign that patience was running out. "Sir, you called us to this property reporting a large quantity of illegal narcotics," the officer said firmly. "You specifically stated you saw a black bag filled with pills. We have searched the accused and found absolutely nothing. Now we have a credible witness stating you were hiding a suspicious object in your own vehicle. Hand over the keys right now." Kendrick started backing away toward the door leading into the main house. Paige finally snapped out of her shocked trance. She stepped in front of her husband, holding her hands up defensively. "Officers, you do not understand," she said, her voice shrill and desperate, relying on her usual privilege. "We are successful people. We live in a highly respected, gated community. My husband is a finance director for a major firm. We do not do drugs. This old man is lying to you. He is trying to frame us because he hates us and he is losing his mind." I just stood there leaning comfortably against my wooden workbench. I did not say a single word to defend myself. I simply let their chaotic panic do all the talking for me. The more they protested and yelled, the more guilty and unhinged they looked to the police. The tall officer pulled out his shoulder radio and spoke a few rapid codes into it. Then he looked at Kendrick again with cold authority. "Sir, if you do not hand over those keys right this second, we will detain you for filing a false police report and we will call a tow truck to impound your luxury vehicle while we go downtown to get a search warrant. Do you understand me?" Kendrick was completely trapped. He was a fundamental coward who had never faced real-world consequences in his entire privileged life. He reached into his tailored slacks with trembling hands and pulled out the shiny key fob to his beloved white BMW. He tossed it onto the workbench with a defeated sigh. It clattered loudly against the wood. The tall officer grabbed it immediately. "Let us take a walk outside," the officer commanded. We all moved out of the dim garage and into the bright morning sunlight of the driveway. The sun was blinding now. A few curious neighbors had already stepped out onto their front porches, drawn by the flashing red and blue police lights. They were standing on their manicured lawns, watching everything unfold. I walked slowly, dragging my feet just a bit, keeping my head down to maintain my flawless role as the tired and broken old father. The tall officer pressed the unlock button on the key fob. The trunk of the pristine white BMW popped open smoothly. Kendrick stood a few feet away, sweating profusely, his chest rising and falling in rapid panic. Paige was clutching his arm so hard her knuckles were completely white. The officer leaned deep into the trunk. He moved a set of expensive golf clubs and some fresh dry cleaning to the side. He lifted the heavy carpeted floorboard that covered the spare tire compartment. I watched Kendrick swallow hard, his throat bobbing. He knew he had put absolutely nothing in there, but he also knew his grand plan had failed. He just did not know how spectacularly it had failed yet. The officer reached deep into the hidden compartment. I heard the distinct rustle of thick plastic bags. When the officer stood back up, he was holding the heavy black bag wrapped tight in silver duct tape. It was the exact bag Kendrick had described in his fake police report just moments earlier. The exact bag he thought he had cleverly hidden in my fishing gear. Kendrick's legs completely gave out beneath him. He stumbled backward, hitting the side of the car with a heavy thud. Paige let out a loud, horrific gasp, covering her mouth with both of her shaking hands. The officer took his tactical pocket knife and sliced open the silver tape. He reached inside and pulled out one of the amber prescription bottles, holding it up to the light. He read the label out loud for everyone to hear. OxyContin, high milligram, no patient name on the label. He looked back inside the bag and pulled out the cheap prepaid burner cell phone. "Turn around and put your hands flat on the hood of the car," the officer barked loudly. It was no longer a request or a negotiation. It was the end of the line. Kendrick froze in place. He slowly turned his head and looked directly at me. His eyes were wide with absolute terror and sudden realization. He finally understood what I had done. He realized the old retired carpenter he thought was a senile fool had completely outsmarted him without breaking a single sweat. "Turn around right now!" the officer yelled, grabbing Kendrick roughly by the shoulder and spinning him around forcefully. Kendrick's chest slammed hard against the warm hood of his shiny, expensive car. The metal clicked sharply as the officer snapped the heavy steel handcuffs tightly around my son's wrists, locking his arms behind his back. "You have the right to remain silent." The officer began reading him his Miranda rights as he aggressively patted him down for weapons. Paige completely lost her mind. She started screaming hysterically, her voice piercing the quiet suburban morning. Her perfect, elegant makeup was running down her face in dark, messy streaks. She let go of her husband and ran toward me, grabbing the fabric of my old flannel shirt. "Lloyd, tell them," she screamed, her voice echoing down the street for all the neighbors to hear. "Tell them it is a massive mistake. Do something right now. You cannot let them take him away. He is your own son. Please do something, Lloyd." I looked down at her manicured hands gripping my shirt. Then I looked up into her panicked, desperate eyes. I felt no pity whatsoever. I felt absolutely no sorrow. I gently but firmly reached up and removed her hands from my clothing. I looked over at Kendrick, who was openly sobbing, now his face pressed awkwardly against the hood of the police cruiser. I did not say a single word to either of them. I turned my back on their screaming, their crying, and their pathetic begging. I walked slowly up my concrete driveway, stepped inside my peaceful house, and quietly shut the heavy front door. The brass deadbolt clicked firmly into place, leaving them outside to face the harsh reality of the world they had just created. The silence in my house after the police cruisers drove away was the most beautiful sound I had heard in years. I walked into the kitchen and poured the rest of my cold coffee down the sink. I washed the mug, drying it slowly with a clean towel. Through the window, I could see the neighbors still standing on the sidewalks, whispering and pointing at my driveway. Kendrick was gone. They had shoved my 40-year-old son into the back of a squad car like a common criminal. It was the very thing he had tried to turn me into just an hour earlier. I felt no regret. I felt no sorrow. I only felt a deep and profound clarity, the kind of clarity that comes when a tumor is finally removed from your life. I walked into the living room and sat down in my favorite armchair, the one Evelyn and I bought 30 years ago. I closed my eyes and thought about my late wife. Evelyn was a woman of immense grace and profound intuition. She never liked Paige. From the very first day Kendrick brought her home, Evelyn told me that Paige had eyes that were always calculating. She said Paige measured the cost of everything but understood the value of absolutely nothing. Evelyn also warned me about Kendrick. She told me we gave him too much too easily. We shielded him from the harsh struggles we faced as black people building a business from the ground up in the 1980s. We gave him a life of comfort and luxury, and it made him soft. It made him greedy and entitled. Now, sitting alone in my quiet house, I knew Evelyn was right all along. The hours passed slowly. I did not turn on the television to distract myself. I did not turn on the radio. I just sat in the quiet, letting the reality of the morning settle into the walls of my home. I knew exactly what was happening downtown. Kendrick was sitting in a sterile, cold interrogation room, sweating through his expensive, tailored suit, trying to explain how a massive bag of high-grade narcotics ended up hidden inside the spare tire compartment of his immaculate white BMW. He was probably crying. He was definitely blaming me. But he had no proof. He had no leverage. He was completely trapped in a cage of his own making. It was late in the afternoon when the telephone finally rang. The sharp sound broke the heavy silence in the living room. I looked at the caller identification screen on the side table. It was Paige. I let it ring 3 times before I slowly picked up the receiver. I pressed the phone to my ear, but I did not say a word. I waited for her to speak first. "Lloyd," she screamed into the phone. Her voice was shrill and frantic, completely stripped of the fake, polite tone she usually used when talking to me. "Lloyd, you have to help us right now. It is a massive disaster. They are holding Kendrick on federal drug conspiracy charges. The judge was talking about denying bail entirely, but we managed to get a sympathetic magistrate. They set his bail at $500,000. We need $50,000 in cash immediately to pay the bondsman, or he is going to spend the entire weekend in the county jail. You have to wire the money to my account right this second." I listened to her hyperventilating through the speaker. She was breathing fast, her words tumbling over each other in sheer panic. But she was not asking for a favor. She was making a demand. She fully expected me to drain my life savings or take out a reverse mortgage on my historic home just to save the man who had tried to destroy my life that very morning. I kept my voice low, flat, and entirely devoid of emotion. "Paige," I said slowly, letting my words sink in. "I do not have $50,000 lying around in cash. I am just a retired carpenter living on a fixed pension. I pay for my groceries and my basic utilities. I do not have the kind of money you are talking about." "Stop lying to me, Lloyd," she snapped, her panic rapidly turning into sharp, vicious irritation. "You own that house free and clear. It is a historic property in a booming neighborhood. It is worth at least $800,000. Call your bank right now. Take out a line of credit against the property. Do whatever you have to do to get the cash. Kendrick is your son. You cannot just leave him sitting in a filthy jail cell with those criminals. He will not survive in there. He is a finance director, not a street thug." I leaned back in my armchair. My heart did not beat any faster. I felt absolutely nothing for her fake tears and her desperate demands. "Paige," I said, keeping my tone perfectly even and completely cold. "You drive a brand new Porsche. Your husband drives a luxury BMW that the police just impounded. You live in a 6-bedroom mansion in a gated community. You wear designer clothes and carry handbags that cost more than my first truck. If you need $50,000 in cash right now, I suggest you call a luxury dealership and sell your Porsche to save your husband. I am not going into debt for you." The line went completely dead for about 10 seconds. I could hear her heavy, ragged breathing echoing through the phone speaker. I knew exactly what was happening in her mind. The gears were aggressively turning. The realization was finally setting in. She was hitting a massive brick wall, and she did not know how to handle someone explicitly saying no to her demands. She had spent her entire adult life manipulating people, bullying her way into luxury, and using her white privilege as an impenetrable shield. But none of that was going to work on me. I was immune to her games. When she finally spoke again, her voice had completely changed. The frantic, worried wife was gone. The polished, successful real estate executive was gone. What was left was the ugly, toxic, and rotting truth of who Paige really was. "You useless old man," she hissed, her voice dripping with pure venom and unmasked disgust. "You think you are so smart, do you not? You think you can just sit there in your dusty old house and pass judgment on us? We gave you everything. We let you be part of our successful lives. We brought you around our wealthy friends. We tolerated your embarrassing presence because we actually felt sorry for you. You are nothing but a ghetto old carpenter who got lucky holding onto a house in a good neighborhood before gentrification happened. You have no class. You have no ambition. You have absolutely nothing to offer this family except that piece of property you are sitting on. She was screaming now, her voice echoing harshly in my ear, but I did not interrupt her. Do you know how embarrassing it is to have you as a father-in-law? She yelled. Do you know how hard I had to work to clean up Kendrick's professional image because he came from a low-class background like yours? We sacrificed our valuable time and our energy to check on you and make sure you were not dead in your chair. And this is how you repay us. You are going to let your own son rot in a federal jail cell because you are too cheap and too ignorant to understand how the real world works. You are a burden, Lloyd. You are a pathetic, worthless burden. You do not deserve to live in that big house. You do not deserve anything we have ever done for you. I sat there and let her scream until her throat was raw. I did not defend myself. I just listened to her pour out all the racial microaggressions and classist hatred she had been hiding behind fake smiles and polite nods for the last 10 years. Every single word she said was like a hammer driving a nail deeper into the coffin of their future. She was proving every single suspicion I ever had about her character. She did not see me as a human being or a father. She saw me as an ignorant old black man sitting on a gold mine, a financial resource to be exploited and quickly discarded when it was no longer useful to her lifestyle. You listen to me, you stubborn old fool, she yelled, her breath hitching with uncontrollable rage. You are going to go to the bank tomorrow morning and you are going to sign the paperwork to get that money, or I swear to God I will make sure you never see. I did not let her finish the sentence. I simply pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button to disconnect the call. I placed the phone gently down on the wooden side table. The silence returned to my living room, wrapping around me like a warm, familiar blanket. I took a deep breath. The air felt infinitely cleaner in my home. The mask had completely slipped and Paige had shown me the ugly, rotting core of her soul. She thought she was threatening me. She thought she was putting me in my place. She truly believed that she held all the power and that I was just a helpless old man who would eventually cave to her relentless demands out of fear and guilt. She had no idea that I was already 10 steps ahead of her. She had no idea that my humble carpenter pension was just a carefully crafted cover story for a massive fortune that could buy her entire real estate firm 10 times over in cash. I stood up from my armchair and walked down the hallway toward my private study. I unlocked the heavy oak door and stepped inside, turning on the small desk lamp. I walked over to the digital safe hidden behind a large wooden bookshelf and spun the combination dial. The heavy metal door clicked open smoothly. I reached inside and pulled out a thick file folder filled with financial documents, blind trust certificates, and direct contact numbers for some of the most powerful corporate lawyers in the state. I pulled out my secure mobile phone. It was time to stop playing the victim. It was time to start dismantling their lives brick by brick. I dialed the number for Malcolm, my private attorney and former federal prosecutor. The phone rang twice before he picked up. The real game was just beginning. How do you feel about the direction the story is taking? I pressed the buttons on my secure mobile phone. Malcolm picked up on the second ring. Malcolm is not just any lawyer. He spent 15 years as a federal prosecutor taking down organized crime rings and corrupt politicians across the state of Georgia. He is a shark in a tailored suit, a brilliant black man who knows exactly how the justice system works because he used to run it from the inside. I told him I needed him at my house immediately. I told him Kendrick had just been arrested by the police after trying to frame me for drug distribution. Malcolm did not gasp. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He did not offer empty sympathy. He just told me he would be at my kitchen table in exactly 20 minutes. True to his word, Malcolm walked through my front door looking like a man ready for war. He carried a heavy leather briefcase and set it down on my scratched wooden kitchen table. He looked around my modest kitchen. He looked at the peeling linoleum floors, the old refrigerator, the faded curtains hanging by the window. To anyone else in the world, this was the home of a poor retired carpenter who barely scraped by on a fixed income. But Malcolm knew the truth. He was one of the very few people on this earth who knew exactly who I was and what I truly possessed. Lloyd, Sir Malcolm said, opening his laptop and booting up his encrypted software. I cannot believe your own son tried to pull a federal drug frame job on you. It is sloppy and it is completely desperate. I sat across from him and poured us both a cup of black coffee. I looked at the dark liquid in my mug and told him that greed makes people do highly reckless things. It made me think back to the 1980s. Back then, I was just a young black man with calloused hands, a heavy hammer, and a massive vision. The commercial banks did not want to lend to me. The wealthy white developers did not want to sign contracts with me. They looked at my skin and decided I was only fit to sweep their job sites. But my wife Evelyn and I worked until our bones literally ached. We pooled every single penny we had and started a small lumber supply yard. Then we bought a struggling cement mixing facility. We worked day and night undercutting the big suppliers and delivering superior materials. Within 10 years, we owned the entire regional supply chain for commercial construction in the state. We were quietly making millions of dollars every single month. But Evelyn was an incredibly wise woman. She saw what sudden new money was doing to the successful families around us. It was tearing their homes apart. It was turning their children into entitled, spoiled brats who respected absolutely nothing and valued nobody. So we made a definitive choice. We took all the corporate shares, all the commercial real estate portfolios, and all the liquid assets, and we buried them deep inside anonymous blind trusts. We hired top-tier wealth managers to erase our names from the public records. On paper, I remained a simple, hard-working carpenter making an honest hourly wage. We wanted Kendrick to learn the true value of hard work. We wanted him to build his own life step by step without waiting for a massive inheritance to simply fall into his lap. The tragic irony tasted bitter in my mouth as I drank my coffee. We hid the money to protect his soul, but he grew up to worship money anyway. He chased the corporate ladder, married a woman who measured human worth entirely in dollar signs, and became the exact kind of monster we tried so hard to prevent. He looked down on me because he thought I was poor. He let his wife call me a ghetto old man because he thought I had no power. He had absolutely no idea that the very construction materials that built his fancy gated community were supplied by a company that I secretly owned. I looked at Malcolm and asked him the one question that had been bothering me all morning. Why drugs? I asked him, leaning forward over the table. Why would Kendrick buy tens of thousands of dollars worth of illicit pills and risk a massive federal trafficking charge just to frame me? If they wanted me out of the house, they could have just tried to legally evict me. If they wanted to control my carpenter pension, they could have tried to declare me mentally unfit in a family court. But a massive drug charge is entirely different. A federal drug charge means the government swoops in. A drug charge means they confiscate property. It was too risky. It was too explosive. Malcolm began typing rapidly on his computer. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he accessed private databases and financial records that the average person does not even know exist. "You are exactly right, Lloyd," he said, his eyes locked strictly on the glowing screen. "A federal drug frame job is the nuclear option. It is the kind of aggressive move someone makes when they are completely out of time and absolutely desperate for a distraction. People do not risk federal prison unless something much worse is already breathing down their neck. We need to look at their money right now. We need to see exactly what Kendrick and Paige have been doing in the dark for the last 6 months." We spent the next 2 hours digging deeply through their digital footprints. Malcolm pulled up their public property records, their mortgage statements, and their corporate tax filings. At first glance, everything looked perfectly normal for a wealthy suburban couple. They had the massive house in the gated community. They had the luxury cars. Paige was posting record-breaking sales numbers at her high-end real estate brokerage. Kendrick was pulling a 6-figure salary as a finance director. They took expensive vacations to Europe and drank imported wine. They projected an image of absolute financial perfection to the entire world. But Malcolm knows exactly how to look behind the curtain. He started tracing the secondary credit lines. He started looking at the hidden shell companies Paige had quietly registered under her maiden name. He followed the digital paper trail that Paige thought she had cleverly hidden from the government. "Wait a minute," Malcolm muttered, leaning much closer to the laptop screen. His brow furrowed in deep concentration. "This makes absolutely no sense. Paige makes a massive commission on commercial properties, but she has not deposited a single commission check into their primary joint bank account in over 8 months. Where is all her money going?" I watched the screen carefully as Malcolm pulled up a secondary bank account linked to her social security number. It was completely drained. Then he pulled up a third account. Drained. They were bleeding cash at a catastrophic rate. Malcolm ran a trace on the outgoing wire transfers. They were moving tens of thousands of dollars every single week to a series of offshore holding companies that Malcolm immediately recognized from his days as a prosecutor. "These are not investment firms," Lloyd Malcolm said, his voice dropping an octave. "These are shadow accounts used by underground syndicates. These are the exact kind of accounts used by aggressive loan sharks and organized crime rings to launder illicit money." The pieces of the puzzle suddenly snapped together, creating a horrifying picture. Kendrick and Page were not just living beyond their means. They were drowning in a highly dangerous ocean. Page must have tried to play the high-stakes commercial real estate game using money she did not actually have and she had clearly lost. She must have borrowed heavy capital from the wrong people to cover her bad investments. And those kinds of people do not send polite collection letters in the mail. They send violent enforcers. They threaten your life. They take everything you love. That explained the sheer panic. That explained why Paige was screaming on the phone demanding $50,000 from me in cash. She was not just trying to bail Kendrick out of the county jail. She was trying to get liquid cash immediately to keep the wolves away from her front door. She was terrified for her own life. But that still did not explain why they needed me locked away in a federal prison. I pointed to the screen and told Malcolm to dig much deeper into my own property records. I told him to check the deed to the very house we were sitting in. If they were that desperate for fast cash, they must have targeted my visible assets. They thought this house was my only possession of value. Malcolm typed in my home address. He accessed the county registry database. The loading icon spun for a few agonizing seconds. When the official document finally appeared on the screen, Malcolm completely froze. The color drained from his face. He slowly turned his laptop around so I could clearly see the screen. "Lloyd," he whispered, his voice filled with absolute disgust and raw anger. "They did not just want to frame you to get you out of the house. They already sold you out to the wolves." I looked at the digital document glowing on the screen. My heart turned to pure ice. It was a secondary mortgage on my historic home. A high-interest predatory mortgage for $500,000 from a shady private lending group. And right there at the bottom of the electronic page was my signature. A signature I had never written. A signature forged by my own son and his wife to steal the roof right over my head. I stared at the glowing screen of Malcolm's laptop. My signature was right there at the bottom of the digital document. But it was not my hand that wrote it. It was a clumsy imitation of forgery executed by two people who thought I was too old and too blind to ever notice. $500,000. That was the amount of the secondary mortgage they had secretly taken out against my historic home. A home that Evelyn and I had paid off entirely in cash over 30 years ago. Malcolm rubbed his temples. His face was a mask of pure professional fury. He started typing again, tracking the routing numbers on that fraudulent loan. He told me that $500,000 did not go into Kendrick or Page bank accounts. It did not go toward a new luxury car or a fancy vacation. The money was wired directly to an offshore holding company within 24 hours of the loan approval. I sat back in my chair. The pieces of this ugly puzzle were finally falling into place, but the picture they formed was darker than anything I could have ever imagined. Malcolm explained that the $500,000 was just a bandage. It was a desperation payment just to cover the interest on a much larger and much more dangerous debt. Malcolm pulled up Page's professional portfolio. He explained how she had been trying to play in the major leagues of commercial real estate. She was tired of selling suburban houses. She wanted to sit at the big table with the wealthy developers and the corporate titans. She wanted the power and the prestige that she always believed she deserved. But Page was arrogant. She was blinded by her own privilege and her insatiable greed. She leveraged herself into a massive commercial development project downtown, hoping to build a luxury retail plaza. It was a doomed venture from the very beginning. She did not understand the zoning laws, and she severely underestimated the supply chain costs. When the traditional banks refused to approve her funding because the project was fundamentally flawed, Page did not walk away. Her ego would not allow her to accept defeat. Instead, she went into the shadows. Malcolm traced the corporate entities and the offshore accounts. Page and Kendrick had borrowed $2 million from a syndicate of ruthless underground lenders. These were not bankers in tailored suits who send polite collection notices in the mail. These were people who operate entirely outside the law. These are the kind of people who take your life or destroy your family when you cannot pay them back. The project collapsed. The money vanished into thin air. and suddenly my son and his arrogant wife found themselves owing $2 million to violent criminals. The sheer magnitude of their stupidity hung heavily in the air of my quiet kitchen. They were living in a massive mansion, driving a Porsche and a BMW, pretending to be the epitome of high society success while secretly drowning in a lethal ocean of debt. Every smile they gave, every condescending remark Paige made about my faded flannel shirts, it was all a pathetic illusion masking their absolute terror. But one question still remained. I looked at Malcolm and asked him the question that had been burning in my chest since the police searched my garage. Why the drugs? If they needed money to pay off the syndicate, why not just forge the deed and try to sell the house out from under me? Why go through the extreme risk of buying thousands of dollars worth of illicit narcotics and calling the police on me? Malcolm closed his laptop. He looked me directly in the eyes. His voice was heavy with the grim reality of the legal system. He told me that forging a mortgage was just a temporary fix to keep the loan sharks from breaking their legs. But selling a historic property outright requires verified signatures, title companies, and notarized physical presence. They could not just sell my house without me knowing. They needed me completely out of the picture. But they could not kill me because an unexplained death triggers a massive police investigation and freezes all the assets in probate court. They needed something much more effective, Malcolm explained. They needed conservatorship. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. Conservatorship. The legal process where a judge declares an elderly person mentally unfit to manage their own life and hands total financial and medical control over to a designated guardian, usually the closest living relative, usually the son. Malcolm laid out their entire sinister plan step by brutal step. If the police had found those narcotics in my tackle box, I would have been arrested immediately. A 75-year-old black man caught with a massive quantity of highly addictive pills and a burner phone. In this country, the narrative writes itself. Kendrick was going to tell the judge that I was suffering from severe dementia, that I was confused and destitute, and that I had turned to hoarding and selling drugs because my mind was completely gone. If I went to a federal prison, I would be helpless. If the judge decided I was too mentally unstable for prison, they would lock me inside a psychiatric ward for the rest of my life. Either way, the result was exactly the same. I would be legally erased. Once I was locked away, Kendrick would step into the courtroom wearing his expensive suit. He would play the role of the heartbroken, deeply concerned son. He would file an emergency petition for conservatorship. He would tell the judge that he needed to take control of his poor, sick father's estate to manage my medical care and protect my assets. And the courts, biased by his polished appearance and my supposed criminal insanity, would hand him the keys to my entire life without a second thought. With a legal conservatorship order, Kendrick and Paige would have absolute power. They could legally list my historic home on the market. They could sell it to the highest bidder. They could drain every single penny from the retirement savings accounts they thought I had. They would take all the money handed over to the underground syndicate to wipe out their $2 million debt and leave me to rot in a sterile, padded room until the day I died. I sat in the silence of my kitchen, absorbing the absolute evil of my own flesh and blood. I had spent 40 years sacrificing my body to give that boy a life of privilege. I had paid for his college. I had bought him his first car. I had stood proudly at his wedding to a woman who looked at me like dirt simply because I wanted him to be happy. And this was how he repaid me. He was willing to destroy my freedom, my dignity, and my sanity just to save his own skin. He was willing to throw his own father into a cage to pay for his wife's greedy mistakes. They did not just view me as a burden. They viewed me as a sacrificial lamb. Malcolm watched me carefully. He has seen the worst of humanity during his time as a federal prosecutor, but I could tell even he was sickened by the sheer depravity of this betrayal. He asked me what I wanted to do. He told me we could take all this evidence straight to the district attorney right now. We could have them arrested for fraud and conspiracy before the sun went down. I slowly shook my head. I stood up from the kitchen table and walked over to the window looking out at the peaceful street. If we went to the police right now, Kendrick and Paige would hire expensive defense lawyers. They would drag it out in court for years. They would play the victims. They would claim they were under extreme duress from the loan sharks. I did not want them to have the luxury of a slow legal battle. I did not want them to find a way to twist the narrative and escape the full weight of their actions. I turned back to Malcolm. I told him that going to the police was not enough. They tried to take my home, my freedom, and my dignity. They tried to strip me of everything that made me a man. If we just handed them over to the authorities, they would never truly understand the magnitude of what they had done. They needed to feel the exact same helplessness they tried to force onto me. They needed to watch their entire fake empire crumble to the ground piece by piece while they stood there completely powerless to stop it. I told Malcolm to prepare the corporate documents. It was time to pull back the curtain on the blind trusts. It was time to show my son and his arrogant wife that the old carpenter they tried to discard was actually the architect of their entire reality. I was going to cut off their oxygen without them even knowing my hands were around their throats. I was going to let the loan sharks applying the pressure do half the work for me. We were going to freeze their assets, revoke their corporate backing, and strip away every single luxury they used to hide their pathetic, rotting lives. Malcolm smiled a cold, predatory smile. He closed his briefcase and stood up. He told me he would make the necessary phone calls to the board of directors and the federal banking authorities. He said he would start the process of isolating them financially, isolating them legally, and trapping them in a corner they could never escape. I thanked Malcolm and walked him to the front door. After he left, I stood alone in my house, the same house my son had secretly mortgaged to criminals. I did not feel sad anymore. The grief of losing the son I thought I had was completely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. Kendrick and Paige wanted to play a high-stakes game of survival. They wanted to see who could be the most ruthless, but they had made one fatal miscalculation. They brought a knife to a war against a man who owned the entire armory. The trap they set for me had failed. Now it was my turn. Malcolm did not pack up his laptop right away. The silence in my kitchen grew heavier, pressing down on us like a physical weight. I could tell by the tight line of his jaw and the cold look in his eyes that we had not reached the bottom of this toxic well. He took a slow breath and turned the computer screen back toward me. He told me to look very closely at the digital document showing the secondary mortgage, $500,000 borrowed against the very walls that surrounded us. I stared at my own forged signature. It was a sloppy imitation, but it was enough to pass a casual inspection. I asked Malcolm how Paige could possibly pull off a massive loan against a historic property without the bank calling me or requiring my physical presence. Malcolm rubbed his temples and explained the terrifying power of her position. Paige was not just an ordinary desperate woman. She was a high-ranking executive at one of the most prestigious and wealthy real estate brokerages in the city. Malcolm traced the digital notary stamp stamped directly on the fraudulent mortgage document. It belonged to a junior associate who worked directly under Paige at her corporate office. Paige had used her professional power, her pristine reputation, and her authority to bypass every single legal safeguard that exists to protect homeowners. She walked into her luxury office and used her position to rubber stamp a forged signature. She bullied or bribed a younger employee into looking the other way. The sheer audacity of her actions made my blood boil. She was so arrogant and so completely confident in her privilege that she truly believed no one would ever double-check the paperwork of a poor old black man. She looked at my faded flannel shirts and my calloused hands and decided I was an easy target. She assumed that an elderly black carpenter living on a pension would not have the financial literacy or the legal resources to ever uncover a sophisticated corporate fraud. She treated my entire life and my only home like a blank check she could sign whenever she felt like it. She thought her status as a successful white executive made her completely untouchable. Malcolm folded his hands on the table. He looked at me with a grim expression and laid out the full scope of the evil plan my son and his wife had engineered. He explained that Kendrick and Paige had built a deadly trap with absolutely no exits. The illegal drugs hidden in my fishing gear earlier that morning were just the accelerator. They needed me locked away in a federal prison or a psychiatric ward immediately because the underground loan sharks were breathing down their necks. If the police had arrested me that morning, Kendrick would have gained legal control of my estate by the end of the month. He would have sold my house, paid off the violent syndicate, and walked away completely clean while I rotted in a jail cell. But Malcolm pointed out the terrifying reality of the forged mortgage sitting on the screen. Even though their drug frame job had failed miserably, the secondary mortgage was already active. The clock was already ticking. Malcolm explained the dilemma perfectly. If I went to prison, they would sell the house to save their own lives. But since I was still sitting in my kitchen completely free, the situation was actually far more dangerous. The underground syndicate now had a legal lien on my property. Paige had handed violent criminals the keys to my front door. Malcolm told me that in a matter of months those loan sharks would come to collect their money. When Kendrick and Page inevitably failed to make the massive interest payments, the syndicate would foreclose on the house. They would send their enforcers to my doorstep. They would throw me out onto the street, or they would do something much worse. Kendrick and Page had set it up so that I would lose absolutely everything no matter what happened. If I went to jail, I lost my home. If I somehow avoided jail and stayed, the criminals would come and take my home anyway. My own son had tied me to the train tracks and smiled while he listened to the whistle blowing in the distance. He had handed my life over to monsters just to cover up his wife's greedy mistakes. I looked around my kitchen. I looked at the worn oak cabinets that I had built with my own 2 hands 40 years ago. I looked at the small scratches on the wooden door frame where I used to measure Kendrick as he grew taller every summer. Evelyn and I bought this piece of land when there was nothing but dirt and broken promises in this neighborhood. We paid for every single brick and every wooden beam with calloused hands and tired backs. We built a regional supply empire, but we chose to live in this modest house because it kept us grounded. This house was a monument to our survival and our love. It was the only place where I could still feel Evelyn sitting beside me. And my son had casually handed it over to a violent criminal syndicate. He sold his mother's memory and his father's safety to save his luxury cars and his country club memberships. The betrayal did not make me want to cry. It did not make me want to scream or throw things across the room. It made me feel incredibly calm. It was a cold, dark calm that settles over a man when he realizes the time for mercy has officially passed. The boy I raised was dead. The man who replaced him was a coward who needed to be taught a permanent lesson. I looked at Malcolm. He was watching my face, waiting for my command. He told me again that we had more than enough evidence to go to the Federal Bureau of Investigation right now. He said we could have Paige arrested for wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and forgery before she even finished her morning coffee. We could have Kendrick arrested for conspiracy and filing a false police report. We could nullify the fraudulent mortgage through the court system immediately and clear my name from the syndicate records. The legal path was right there waiting for us to take it. I shook my head slowly. I told Malcolm that calling the authorities right now was the easy way out for them. If they went to jail today, they would just blame each other. They would hide behind their expensive defense lawyers and cry about making mistakes under extreme financial pressure. They would never truly understand the absolute terror they tried to inflict on me. I wanted them to feel the walls closing in. I wanted them to wake up every single morning wondering why their perfect fake lives were suddenly falling apart. I wanted the underground syndicate to squeeze them until they could not breathe. I told Malcolm to let the forged mortgage stay exactly as it was for now. I told him not to alert the banks and not to alert the police. Malcolm looked at me with deep surprise, but he slowly nodded his head. He knew I was no longer playing defense. The silent war had just escalated to a level they could not even comprehend. I instructed Malcolm to start targeting their oxygen supply. I wanted Paige frozen out of her corporate commissions immediately. I wanted Kendrick cut off from every single financial safety net he had ever relied on. We were going to trap them in the exact same burning building they had tried to lock me inside, and we were going to throw away the key. I wanted them to look over their shoulders every time a car drove slowly past their luxury mansion. I wanted them to feel the cold sweat of panic when their credit cards declined at their fancy restaurants. They had built a house of cards on top of my name, and I was going to pull out the bottom row without making a single sound. Malcolm closed his laptop with a sharp click. The game was set. The rules had changed. Kendrick and Page were about to learn what happens when you try to bury a man who owns the shovel. I watched my own son sneak into my garage and bury a heavy black bag at the bottom of my fishing gear. When I opened it and saw enough narcotics to put me away for the rest of my life, I did not scream. I did not call the police. I just took that bag, walked over to his brand new BMW, and shoved it deep into his spare tire compartment. 30 minutes later, when the sirens wailed down my driveway, my son thought he was about to watch me lose everything. He had no idea he had just dug his own grave. Before I tell you how this all went down, let me know in the comments where you are listening from today. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe that respect is earned no matter who you are dealing with. My name is Lloyd Daniels. I am 75 years old. To the outside world, and especially to my son Kendrick and his wife Paige, I am just a tired, retired carpenter living out his final days on a modest pension. They look at my calloused hands and faded flannel shirts and see a man who has outlived his usefulness, a man they can easily step over. What they do not know is that those same hands built a regional construction supply empire back in the 1980s. I secured my wealth in blind trust decades ago to protect my family from the very greed I am staring at right now. The house was incredibly quiet the morning after Kendrick was arrested. I was sitting in my favorite armchair watching the dust motes float in the sunlight streaming through the front window. Malcolm had called me an hour earlier to deliver the latest update on my son. Kendrick was no longer sitting in a cold federal holding cell. He was out on bail. Malcolm explained that the judge had set a steep price for his temporary freedom, and Paige had somehow managed to come up with the cash. But she did not sell her luxury car, and she did not liquidate her designer wardrobe. Malcolm traced the money and discovered that Paige had gone back to the same violent underground syndicate. She borrowed even more dirty money at an astronomical interest rate just to pay the bondsman. They were digging their own graves deeper and deeper with every single decision they made. I knew they would be coming to my house. They were desperate. They were cornered animals bleeding cash and running out of time. The failed drug frame job meant they still did not have legal control over my estate. They still needed my signature or my incapacitation to sell this historic property and pay off the ruthless criminals breathing down their necks. I stood up from my chair and walked over to the heavy oak coffee table in the center of the living room. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a sleek silver ink pen. It looked like an ordinary expensive writing tool, the kind a successful executive might carry in his breast pocket. But it was a piece of high-tech surveillance equipment Malcolm had given me the night before. It recorded crystal-clear high-definition audio. I pressed the tiny hidden button on the top of the pen. A microscopic blue light flashed once, indicating that the microphone was active and recording every sound in the room. I laid the pen casually next to a stack of old mail and some magazines on the table. Less than 20 minutes later, I heard the sound of tires crunching on the gravel of my driveway. I looked through the sheer curtains and saw a dark rental car pull up. Kendrick and Paige stepped out. They looked absolutely terrible. The polished, arrogant veneer they usually wore was completely shattered. Kendrick was wearing the same wrinkled suit he had been arrested in. His shoulders were slumped and his face was pale and drawn. Paige looked exhausted, her hair pulled back into a messy knot, her eyes hidden behind oversized dark sunglasses. But as they walked up my front steps, I could see them physically adjusting their posture. I saw Paige take a deep breath and force her facial features into an expression of deep, tragic sorrow. They were preparing to put on the performance of a lifetime. The doorbell rang twice. I waited a few moments before walking to the door, dragging my feet slightly to sound older and weaker than I actually was. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Kendrick immediately crumbled into a pathetic display of fake emotion. He reached out and wrapped his arms around me, pulling me into a desperate hug. I stood perfectly rigid, letting him weep onto my shoulder. He sobbed loudly, apologizing for bringing police to my doorstep, saying it was all a massive misunderstanding. Paige stood right behind him, wiping non-existent tears from her cheeks. She looked at me with an expression of pure manufactured sympathy. It was absolutely sickening to watch. Just 24 hours earlier, she had screamed through the telephone, calling me a useless ghetto old man and threatening to destroy my life. Now she was standing on my porch, playing the role of the sweet, devoted daughter-in-law who just wanted to protect her poor elderly father-in-law. I stepped back and invited them inside. I walked slowly toward the living room, keeping my head slightly bowed. I gestured for them to sit on the sofa opposite my armchair. The silver recording pen rested silently on the coffee table right between us, capturing every single breath they took. Kendrick leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He looked at me with wide, innocent eyes and began spinning the most ridiculous web of lies I had ever heard. He told me that the drugs the police found in his car were planted there by corporate enemies. He claimed that his immense success as a finance director had made him a target for ruthless competitors who wanted to ruin his career and steal his clients. He said these invisible enemies had hired criminals to sneak onto my property and stash the narcotics in my garage, hoping to frame our entire family. He spun a wild tale about police corruption and targeted harassment, trying to convince me that we were all in terrible danger from outside forces. I sat there and nodded slowly. I widened my eyes and let my hands tremble just a little bit, resting them on my knees. I played the part of the terrified, confused old black man perfectly. I asked him in a shaky voice why anyone would want to hurt us. I asked him if the police were going to come back and take me away to prison. Paige immediately jumped into the conversation, sliding right next to Kendrick on the sofa. She reached across the coffee table and gently placed her hand over mine. Her skin was ice cold. She told me not to worry about a thing. She said they would never let anyone hurt me. But then her voice dropped to a serious, urgent whisper. She said that because the police had searched my property, the federal government might try to seize my assets during the investigation. She claimed that corrupt prosecutors often freeze bank accounts and confiscate homes belonging to innocent family members just to build their cases. She painted a terrifying picture of the government coming to kick me out of my historic home and leaving me destitute on the streets. I let out a soft, fake gasp. I looked around my living room, acting as if I was watching my entire life slip away. I asked them what we could possibly do to stop the government from taking my home. That was the exact moment Kendrick pulled the trap. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He laid them carefully on the coffee table right next to the recording pen. He told me that his high-priced corporate lawyers had come up with a foolproof plan to protect my estate. All I had to do was sign a comprehensive power of attorney agreement. He explained that if I legally transferred the management of my property and my finances over to him, the government would not be able to touch my assets. He promised that he would place my house and my pension into a secure protective trust until the investigation blew over. Kendrick looked me dead in the eyes and lied with the smooth, practiced ease of a true sociopath. He said he was only doing this out of love. He said he could not bear the thought of his hardworking father losing the only home he had ever known. But beneath the sugary words I could hear the veiled threats. He subtly hinted that if I did not sign the paperwork immediately, the police might return and consider me an active accomplice in the drug trafficking ring. He insinuated that my age and my race would make me an easy target for a biased judge and that I would not survive a week in a federal holding facility. Paige chimed in, her voice dripping with poisonous manipulation. She told me that time was running out. She said the lawyers needed the paperwork filed by tomorrow morning or it would be too late to save the house. She even brought her own luxury fountain pen out of her purse, clicking it open and offering it to me with a tight, forced smile. She was practically begging me to sign my own death warrant right there in my living room. I looked down at the thick stack of papers. I knew exactly what they were. It was not a protective trust. It was a complete surrender of my life. If my name went on that dotted line, Kendrick would have the absolute legal authority to sell this house to the highest bidder by noon tomorrow. He would take the money, pay off his violent underground creditors, and leave me absolutely penniless. They would save their own miserable lives by throwing me completely under the bus. I reached out with a trembling hand and gently touched the edge of the documents. I did not take Paige up on her offer of the pen. Instead, I let out a long, weary sigh. I looked at Kendrick and told him that my eyes were just too tired to read all that fine print today. I told him that the stress of the police raid had exhausted me and I could barely focus on the words. I patted the stack of papers and promised him I would put on my reading glasses tonight and look over everything very carefully. I told him I would have it all signed and ready for him by tomorrow morning. Panic flashed across Paige's face for a brief second. She opened her mouth to argue, to push me to sign it right now, but Kendrick quickly put a hand on her knee to silence her. He knew better than to push a frightened old man too hard and risk ruining the illusion of safety. He forced a warm, grateful smile. He told me to take my time and rest. He said he would come back first thing in the morning to pick up the documents and take them straight to the lawyers. They stood up from the sofa, playing the loving children right until the very end. Kendrick hugged me again and Paige gave me a sickeningly sweet kiss on the cheek. I walked them to the front door and watched them get into their rental car. As they drove away down the street, I closed the heavy wooden door and locked the deadbolt. I walked back into the living room and stared at the coffee table. The stack of fraudulent legal documents sat there representing their ultimate betrayal. But right next to those papers was the sleek silver pen. I picked it up and pressed the tiny hidden button on the top to stop the recording. The blue light flashed twice and went dark. I held the pen in my hand, feeling the solid weight of the absolute destruction it contained. I had captured every single lie. I had captured their coercion, their fake stories about corporate enemies, and their subtle threats about the police. It was the ultimate ammunition. I did not just have proof of their intent to commit real estate fraud. I had a crystal-clear audio recording of them conspiring to manipulate a federal investigation and steal assets under false pretenses. They thought they had successfully planted the seed of my ruin. They had absolutely no idea that I had just recorded their full confession. The trap was locked and the timer was finally set. I sat in the quiet of my living room holding the silver pen in my hand. The weight of that small device felt heavier than a hammer. It held the voices of my son and his wife actively plotting to destroy my life. They had driven away in their rental car fully believing they had won. They thought they had planted the perfect trap, and that I was just a frightened old man ready to sign away his home and his dignity. But I was done playing the frightened old man. I was done playing defense. It was time to go on the offense. I was going to dismantle their lives brick by brick, and I was going to do it without leaving a single fingerprint. To understand exactly how I was going to destroy them, you have to understand exactly what Evelyn and I built all those years ago. When we started our supply business in the 1980s, we did not just stop at lumber and cement. As the city grew, we saw the opportunity to expand. We started buying up commercial real estate firms and luxury brokerages. But because of the color of our skin and the prejudices of the corporate world, we knew our names on the door would limit our growth. So we buried our ownership deep inside a complex web of anonymous blind trusts and holding companies. We hired expensive corporate lawyers to act as the public faces of our empire. Paige was a vice president at the most prestigious luxury real estate brokerage in the entire metropolitan area. She walked through those glass doors every single morning in her designer shoes, looking down her nose at the working-class people she passed on the street. She thought her title made her invincible. She thought her six-figure commissions elevated her above people like me. She called me a useless ghetto carpenter. She had absolutely no idea that the massive corporate conglomerate she worked for was a direct subsidiary of the blind trust that I fully controlled. I was not just her father-in-law. I was the silent architect of her entire career. I was her ultimate boss. She was swimming in my pool, and she did not even know it. I picked up my secure mobile phone and dialed Malcolm. When he answered, I told him it was time to initiate the invisible strike. I did not want to involve the police just yet. Handing them over to the authorities would be too quick and too easy. I wanted them to feel the exact same suffocating panic they had tried to force onto me. I wanted them to watch the walls of their lavish lifestyle close in on them, while the underground loan sharks breathed heavily down their necks. Malcolm patched me through on a secure conference call to the executive board of directors for the real estate brokerage. These were men and women who managed billions of dollars in assets, but they knew exactly whose money they were managing. When I spoke, they listened with absolute obedience. I did not raise my voice. I did not show any anger. I simply issued a directive. I told the board that there were serious, credible allegations of financial misconduct and contract manipulation regarding one of their top executives. I gave them the name of my daughter-in-law. I instructed them to launch an immediate internal audit into all of her active contracts, her pending sales, and her escrow accounts. The corporate world moves incredibly fast when the invisible hand at the top pulls the strings. Within 1 hour of that phone call, the entire financial foundation of Paige collapsed. The board of directors did exactly what I commanded. They locked her out of the corporate network. They deactivated her security badges. And most importantly, they completely froze her corporate bank accounts. Every single pending commission she had lined up to pay off the violent underground syndicate was suspended indefinitely under the guise of a severe internal investigation for contract fraud. Her bonuses were revoked. Her corporate credit cards were instantly declined. Let us talk about what it takes to build a legacy. When Evelyn and I started our first supply yard, we did not take weekends off. We worked through the holidays. We unloaded heavy cement bags in the pouring rain while our competitors sat in dry, comfortable offices. We faced constant discrimination from loan officers who smiled to our faces and threw our applications in the trash the moment we walked out the door. Every single dollar we made was earned through blood, sweat, and absolute determination. We built a foundation so deep and so strong that no economic downturn could ever shake it. We funneled that money into commercial real estate, buying up prime locations before the city even knew they were valuable. We handed the management over to blind trusts so we could live in peace without the target of massive wealth painted on our backs. Then you have someone like Paige. She grew up with a silver spoon in her mouth and a heart full of unearned arrogance. She married my son and convinced him that real success comes from cutting corners and stepping on the backs of the vulnerable. She thought she was a genius for leveraging money she did not have into a commercial project she did not understand. She thought borrowing millions from violent street thugs was just the cost of doing big business. She played a dangerous game and she lost spectacularly. But instead of taking responsibility for her catastrophic failures, she looked at my historic home and saw a convenient escape hatch. She looked at me and saw a disposable old man. I wanted her to experience the crushing weight of real consequence. I wanted her to feel what it is like to stand on the edge of a cliff with nothing to catch you when you fall. Malcolm told me that when the Human Resources Department called Paige into the conference room, She tried to use her usual intimidation tactics. She threatened to sue the company. She threatened to call her powerful connections. She demanded to speak to the chief executive officer immediately. She screamed that she was the top earner in the firm and that they were making a massive mistake. The human resources director simply handed her a printed notice. It detailed the freezing of all her financial assets within the company pending a comprehensive federal audit. It stated that her access to client escrow accounts had been revoked due to highly suspicious activity. The moment Paige read the words federal audit, her entire demeanor collapsed. She stopped screaming. She stopped threatening lawsuits. The blood drained from her face and she started shaking uncontrollably. She knew exactly what a federal audit would uncover. She knew the auditors would find the illegal wire transfers she had been making to the underground syndicate holding companies. She knew her career was completely over and her freedom was hanging by a very thin thread. She packed her desk in complete silence. Her wealthy colleagues, the same people she used to drink expensive champagne with, stared at her as she walked down the long hallway carrying her cardboard box. The humiliation must have been absolute torture for a woman whose entire identity was tied to her perceived superiority. She walked out into the busy city streets, stripped of her title, her money, and her power. They needed that money to survive. Malcolm had already shown me the paper trail. Paige and Kendrick were drowning in $2 million of illicit debt. The loan sharks they borrowed from do not care about internal corporate audits. They do not care about frozen accounts or human resources investigations. They only care about getting their cash on time. By freezing her commissions, I had just cut off her only oxygen supply. She was completely suffocating, and she had absolutely no idea that my hands were the ones tightening around her throat. She would try to call her banking contacts. She would try to leverage her wealthy friends. But in the world of high finance, the moment the word fraud is attached to your name, you become highly radioactive. No one would answer her calls. No one would offer her a loan. Her wealthy elite circle would drop her faster than a bad habit. She was about to experience the exact same isolation and helplessness she had so casually wished upon me. This was the beauty of the invisible strike. I was sitting comfortably in my worn armchair miles away, sipping my dark coffee and listening to the soft hum of my refrigerator. I had destroyed the financial empire of my daughter-in-law with a single phone call, and she would never be able to trace it back to me. She was wandering the streets right now, frantically trying to figure out how she was going to pay the loan sharks who were undoubtedly waiting for their monthly interest payment. She was trapped in a nightmare of her own design, but I was not finished yet. As the evening sky turned a dark shade of purple, I knew it was time to move on to the next phase of the operation. Paige had been neutralized, but my son Kendrick still thought he held the winning hand. He still thought he was going to walk into my house tomorrow morning and collect a signed power of attorney document. He thought his luxury lifestyle was secure. He needed to be reminded that the man who gave him everything could take it all away just as easily. The invisible strike was going to hit him next, and it was going to hit him where it hurt the most. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across my living room. I sat alone in my armchair, listening to the steady ticking of the antique grandfather clock against the wall. Paige was currently wandering the city streets, completely stripped of her corporate power and her financial access. I had crushed her career with a single phone call, and she had absolutely no idea that I was the one holding the hammer. But my work was only half finished. Paige was the arrogant mastermind, but Kendrick was my own flesh and blood. He was the son I raised, the boy who looked me in the eye and lied to my face while plotting to lock me inside a psychiatric ward. He still believed he was going to walk into my house tomorrow morning and collect a signed document handing over my entire estate. He needed to learn that actions have severe and permanent consequences. It was time to choke the life out of my son and his fake empire. I picked up my secure phone and called Malcolm. I told him we were moving to the next phase of the operation. To understand Kendrick, you have to understand his lifelong obsession with status. Kendrick always wanted to look like the wealthiest man in the room. He wanted the tailored suits, the expensive watches, and the luxury vehicles. But when he and Paige first bought that massive house in their gated community, they stretched their finances to the absolute breaking point. They wanted to buy a pristine white luxury sedan for him and a sleek sports car for her. The dealerships looked at their debt-to-income ratio and flatly refused. They needed a guarantor. They needed someone with perfect credit and massive hidden assets to co-sign the loans. Like a foolish, loving father, I stepped in. I quietly co-signed the paperwork for both of those luxury vehicles. I put my flawless credit on the line so my son could drive around the city feeling like a king. I did not ask for a thank you. I did not ask to drive the cars. I just wanted him to be happy. And how did he repay me? He drove that exact same white car to my house this morning with a trunk full of illegal narcotics, hoping to send me to a federal prison. I told Malcolm to pull the paperwork on those auto loans. As a co-signer, I had certain legal rights, especially since Malcolm had already uncovered that Kendrick had been missing payments and moving money to offshore syndicate accounts. Malcolm contacted the lending institutions directly. He provided them with the documented proof of Kendrick participating in massive financial fraud and facing active federal investigations. He legally withdrew my backing as the guarantor. The banks did not hesitate. When a high-risk client loses their wealthy guarantor and is tied to illicit loan sharks, the banks act with brutal efficiency. They immediately declared the auto loans in default and issued active repossession orders for both vehicles. But withdrawing the cars was just a physical blow. I wanted to destroy his digital life too. Malcolm and I moved on to the credit cards. Over the past few years, Kendrick had quietly opened several secondary credit lines. He used my name, my social security number, and my pristine credit history to secure massive limits. He thought I was just an ignorant old black man who did not know how to check his credit report. He used my identity to fund his expensive dinners, his luxury vacations, and his country club fees. He drained thousands of dollars, treating my good name like his own personal bank. Malcolm did not just close the accounts. He went straight to the federal fraud departments and the major credit bureaus. He filed official reports for severe identity theft and financial elder abuse. He provided the digital footprints proving that Kendrick had forged my signature to open those accounts and sustain his lifestyle. The credit bureaus moved with ruthless speed. Within a matter of hours, the algorithms caught up to Kendrick and Page. Their credit scores did not just drop, they plummeted to absolute zero. Every single financial safety net they had was instantly vaporized. Their primary credit cards were frozen. Their emergency backup cards were declined. If they tried to buy a simple cup of coffee, the transaction would be rejected. They were already drowning in $2 million of debt to violent underground criminals, and now they could not even access a single legitimate dollar to buy themselves a meal. I was cutting off their oxygen supply molecule by molecule. I sat in the dark of my kitchen and imagined the scene that was about to unfold. I knew exactly how repo men operated. They do not come during the day when you can argue with them. They come in the dead of night when you are deeply asleep and completely vulnerable. It was 3 a.m. The upscale suburban neighborhood where Kendrick and Page lived was perfectly silent. The massive houses with their manicured lawns and tall iron gates projected an image of absolute security and untouchable wealth. The residents of that neighborhood slept soundly, believing their money kept all the ugly problems of the world far away from their doorsteps. Then the heavy diesel engines rumbled down the quiet street. 2 massive tow trucks rolled past the security gates. The guards did not stop them because repo men carry official court orders that override any neighborhood security protocol. The trucks crept slowly toward the driveway of my son. Flashing amber lights cut through the darkness, painting the front of their luxury mansion in bright warning colors. The harsh mechanical sound of hydraulic lifts lowering and chains clanking echoed loudly, shattering the peaceful suburban silence. Inside the master bedroom, Kendrick and Page woke up in a state of absolute panic. They probably thought the loan sharks had finally come to collect their debt. They probably thought violent enforcers were breaking down their front door. Kendrick stumbled out of bed, his heart hammering against his ribs. He ran to the window and looked down at his driveway. He saw the first tow truck backing up right to the bumper of his beloved white luxury car. He saw the second truck hooking heavy steel chains underneath the sleek sports car belonging to Page. The repo men were moving with practiced speed, securing the tires and lifting the expensive cars off the pavement. Kendrick sprinted down the grand staircase wearing nothing but his silk pajamas. He threw open the heavy wooden front door and ran barefoot onto the cold concrete of his driveway. He screamed at the men, demanding they stop immediately. He yelled that he was a successful finance director and that this was a massive mistake. He ordered them to put his car down before he called the police and had them arrested for vehicle theft. Paige ran out right behind him. She was crying and shivering in the cold night air. The flashing amber lights illuminated her tear-stained face. She yelled that her sports car was fully paid for and that they were trespassing on private property. The lead repo man did not even flinch. He did not care about their big house or their silk pajamas. He calmly pulled out a thick clipboard and shoved the official bank repossession orders right into the chest of my son. He told Kendrick that the loans were in severe default and the primary guarantor had legally withdrawn all financial backing due to active fraud investigations. The repo man told them that their credit was completely frozen and their accounts were flagged for identity theft. He advised them to step back or he would call the local authorities to arrest them for interfering with a lawful repossession. Lights began to turn on in the houses all around them. The wealthy elite neighbors stepped out onto their balconies and porches drawn by the screaming and the flashing lights. The same neighbors Paige used to impress with her fake wealth were now watching her absolute humiliation. They watched as the tow trucks lifted the pristine vehicles high into the air and dragged them unceremoniously out of the driveway. Kendrick stood barefoot on the cold concrete watching his entire fake empire roll down the street and disappear into the dark night. He had no cars. He had no credit. His wife had no job and no corporate backing. They were completely stranded in a massive house they could no longer afford, owing $2 million to people who would not hesitate to end their lives. Back in my quiet living room, my secure phone vibrated on the coffee table. The screen lit up in the dark. It was a simple text message from Malcolm confirming that the repossession was successful and the credit blocks were fully active. The operation had executed perfectly without a single flaw. I leaned my head back against my armchair and let out a long, slow breath. I did not feel any joy in destroying my own son, but I felt a profound sense of justice. They tried to throw me into a cage so they could steal my home. Now they were the ones trapped in a nightmare they could never wake up from. Tomorrow morning, Kendrick would not come to my house demanding my signature. He would be too busy trying to figure out how to survive the day. The silent war was almost over, and I had completely decimated their ranks without ever leaving my chair. The sun rose over the city the next morning, illuminating a world that had completely shifted on its axis. I sat at my kitchen table with a fresh cup of dark coffee watching the morning news on my small television. My house was perfectly quiet. But miles away in an upscale gated community, the walls were rapidly closing in on my son and his arrogant wife. They were waking up to a reality they were entirely unprepared to face. They had spent their entire adult lives building a fortress of fake wealth, and in less than 24 hours, I had systematically dismantled every single brick. Malcolm called me precisely at 8 in the morning. His voice was sharp and strictly professional. He had a private investigator parked in a discreet vehicle just outside the security gates of their neighborhood. The investigator was monitoring the fallout of our invisible strike. Malcolm reported that Kendrick and Paige were currently trapped inside their massive 6-bedroom mansion. They had no vehicles in their driveway. The pristine white luxury sedan and the sleek sports car were sitting in a bank impound lot on the other side of the city. In a sprawling suburban neighborhood, having no car is the equivalent of having no legs. You cannot walk to a grocery store. You cannot walk to a law office. You are a prisoner in your own home. But the lack of transportation was just the beginning of their nightmare. Malcolm explained that Paige had tried to use a rideshare application on her phone to summon a luxury vehicle to pick them up. She needed to get downtown to beg her corporate board of directors to lift the freeze on her accounts. But the application immediately rejected her request. She tried to input a second credit card, and it was instantly declined. She tried a third and a fourth. Every single piece of plastic in her designer wallet was now completely useless. The identity theft reports and the fraud alerts had spread through the financial networks like wildfire. Their credit scores were completely decimated. They had millions of dollars in projected real estate assets and a massive wardrobe of designer clothes, but they could not even scrape together $30 in digital credit to hire a driver. They were drowning in the shallow end of the pool, and the water was only getting higher. The financial chokehold was tightening around their throats, but the real terror was not coming from the banks or the credit bureaus. The real terror was coming from the shadows. Malcolm had tapped into their digital communications through legal discovery channels related to the identity theft case. He told me that the burner phones Paige and Kendrick kept hidden in their home had been ringing non-stop since dawn. The violent underground syndicate they borrowed $2 million from did not care about corporate audits. They did not care about repossessed vehicles or frozen credit lines. They only cared about their money, and the monthly interest payment was due. Malcolm relayed the messages the loan sharks were sending. They were not polite reminders. They were chilling, highly specific threats. The syndicate sent a photograph of the front of their mansion taken in the dead of night. Then they sent a photograph of the street where Paige had grown up. The message was crystal clear. We know exactly where you sleep and we know exactly where your family lives. pay us by the end of the week or we will stop sending photographs and start sending enforcers. Panic is a fascinating thing to observe. When a house catches on fire, people do not calmly discuss the best exit strategy. They trample over each other trying to reach the door. Kendrick and Paige were standing in the middle of a burning room and the heat was finally starting to melt their polished masks. The extreme pressure was violently fracturing their unified front. They were no longer the arrogant power couple plotting to steal an old man's home. They were two desperate, cornered animals, and they immediately turned their fangs on each other. I did not need Malcolm to tell me they were fighting. I heard it with my own 2 ears. At exactly 10 in the morning, my secure mobile phone rang. It was Kendrick. I let it ring 4 times before I pressed the green button and held the device to my ear. I did not say a word. I just breathed quietly and listened to the absolute chaos unfolding on the other end of the line. Dad Kendrick gasped, his voice cracking with sheer hysteria. "Dad, please tell me you signed the power of attorney documents. Please tell me you have the paperwork ready. I need to come over there right now. I need to sell the house. Everything is falling apart. The cars are gone. The credit cards are blocked. I do not know what is happening. The universe is punishing us. We are under attack and I need that money today." He genuinely believed it was all just incredibly bad luck. He thought the universe was aligning against him. He had absolutely no idea that the universe was sitting in a worn armchair sipping coffee and listening to him cry. Before I could even formulate a response, I heard a loud crash in the background. It sounded like a glass vase shattering against a hardwood floor. Then I heard Paige screaming. Her voice was not the sweet melodic tone she used to manipulate clients. It was a guttural, vicious shriek filled with raw hatred. "Are you begging your pathetic father on the phone right now?" Paige screamed, her voice echoing through the massive empty rooms of their mansion. "Do not waste your breath, Kendrick. He is a useless old fool who cannot even read a legal document without falling asleep. This is entirely your fault." "My fault," Kendrick yelled back, pulling the phone slightly away from his mouth so I could hear the full volume of their vicious argument. "You are the one who borrowed $2 million from violent street thugs. You are the one who thought you were a real estate genius. You wanted to play with the billionaires and you lost everything. You dragged us into a death trap because your ego is bigger than your brain. Do not you dare blame my ambition." Paige shrieked, her voice reaching a pitch that made my ears ring. "I was trying to elevate us. I was trying to build a legacy. The only reason we are trapped in this nightmare right now is because you are a weak, incompetent coward. I handed you a foolproof plan. All you had to do was plant those pills in his fishing gear and call the police. A simple frame job. It was the easiest task in the world and you failed. You let a 75-year-old carpenter completely outsmart you. You let him humiliate you in front of the police. If you were half the man you pretend to be, your father would be rotting in a psychiatric ward right now, and we would have the keys to his estate." I listened to her viciously tear down the man she promised to love and honor. She stripped away every ounce of his dignity. She threw his failure right in his face, proving that her affection for him was entirely conditional upon his ability to provide her with luxury and obey her commands. She did not love him. She only loved what she thought she could steal through him. "You are insane," Kendrick roared back, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and terror. "You are the one who forged his signature on a $500,000 mortgage. You committed federal wire fraud. When the company finds out what you did, when the Federal Bureau of Investigation finishes their audit, you are going to federal prison for a very long time. And the syndicate is going to kill us before you even see the inside of a courtroom. You destroyed my life. I should have never married a greedy, manipulative woman like you. I married down." Paige screamed, her voice dripping with the familiar racial microaggressions she could no longer hide. "I lowered my standards for you. I spent years trying to scrub the ghetto off of you. I tried to make you presentable to high society, and this is what I get. A pathetic, weak little boy crying to his daddy on the phone because he is too stupid to execute a basic plan. You are just like him, Kendrick. You are just a mediocre man pretending to be important." I listened to the sound of breaking glass and the heavy thud of furniture being thrown across their living room. They were physically and verbally destroying each other. The perfect wealthy couple, the shining example of upper-class success, was currently tearing each other to pieces like wild dogs fighting over a scrap of meat. The immense pressure of the financial chokehold had completely shattered their loyalty. There was no love left in that house. There was only fear, regret, and a desperate, violent urge to survive at the expense of the other. Dad Kendrick sobbed, bringing the phone back to his mouth. His breathing was heavy and ragged. "Please do not listen to her. She is losing her mind. I need your help. I need you to sign those papers today. I will call a taxi. I will walk to your house if I have to. Just please have the documents ready. They are going to hurt us, Dad. They are going to come to the house and hurt us. I am begging you." I held the phone to my ear. I listened to his desperate pleas. I listened to the sound of my son realizing that his life was completely over. He was begging for salvation from the very man he had tried to throw into a cage just 24 hours earlier. He wanted me to hand over my home, my sanctuary, and my entire life savings just to shield him from the violent consequences of his own greedy choices. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I did not hurl insults the way Paige had done. I simply spoke to him with the cold, unyielding authority of a man who controls the entire board. "Kendrick," I said, my voice slicing through his panicked sobbing like a sharp blade, "you made your choices. You decided that my life was worthless. You decided that my home was just a bank account waiting to be drained. You brought violent criminals into our lives and you tried to sacrifice me to save yourself. You are not a victim. You are a consequence, and consequences must be paid in full." "Dad, please, no," Kendrick cried out. I did not let him finish. I pressed the button and disconnected the call. I placed the secure mobile phone gently on the table. The silence in my kitchen was absolute. The war was raging miles away, tearing through their mansion and destroying their marriage. But here in my home there was only peace. They still believed this was all a tragic string of bad luck. They still thought the universe was just punishing them. They were completely unaware that the invisible hand slowly tightening the noose around their necks belonged to the old man they had tried so hard to discard. I poured myself another cup of coffee. The final act was approaching, and I was ready to watch the curtain fall. The dust had barely settled from the explosive argument between my son and his wife. I sat in my quiet kitchen sipping my dark coffee and watching the morning light filter through the old oak trees in my front yard. Kendrick and Paige were living in a nightmare of their own making. Their luxury cars were gone. Their credit was completely destroyed. They were trapped in a massive mansion they could no longer afford, with violent underground criminals circling their neighborhood like starving wolves. You would think that a woman in her situation would humble herself. You would think that a person drowning in $2 million of illicit debt would hide in the shadows and beg for mercy. But you do not understand the sheer magnitude of her arrogance. Paige was a woman who believed her own lies. She believed that her privilege and her status made her completely untouchable, even when the ground was literally crumbling beneath her expensive designer shoes. Malcolm called me later that afternoon to give me an update on her movements. He had his private investigators tracking her every desperate attempt to find a lifeline. He told me that Paige was not packing her bags to flee the city. She was not preparing to confess to the police. Instead, she was doubling down on her delusions. She was organizing a high-society luxury real estate auction gala. It was a massive, glamorous event that had been on the corporate calendar for months, well before I froze her accounts and initiated the federal audit. The grand ballroom at the downtown plaza was already paid for by the brokerage firm, and the invitations to the wealthiest investors in the city had already been sent out. Malcolm explained that Paige was using this gala as her absolute last-ditch effort to save her own life. She planned to stand on that brightly lit stage and hustle millions of dollars in investment capital from unsuspecting rich buyers. She was going to pitch them a fraudulent commercial real estate project, collect their massive deposit checks, and use that liquid cash to pay off the underground loan sharks before they broke down her front door. It was a desperate and highly illegal move, but it was the only play she had left. She was hunting for whales, and she was willing to say or do absolutely anything to secure their money. I listened to Malcolm explain her frantic strategy, and I could not help but shake my head. Paige was walking on a tightrope over a volcano, and she was still trying to put on a spectacular show. She did not know that the corporate audit I ordered was silently gathering every piece of evidence needed to send her to a federal prison. She did not know that the chief executive officer of her brokerage was already preparing to terminate her license and hand her files over to the authorities. She thought she still had time. She thought the old black carpenter she despised was just sitting in his historic home waiting for the bank to foreclose on the forged secondary mortgage. She believed her plan to lock me away was still slowly working its way through the system. Her ego was so massive that it completely blinded her to the reality of her impending destruction. She truly believed she was the smartest person in any room she walked into. She thought she could outsmart the loan sharks, outsmart her corporate bosses, and outsmart the universe itself. That same evening, I heard the distinct sound of the mail slot opening and closing on my front porch. I walked down the hallway and picked up a thick, heavy envelope resting on the hardwood floor. It was made of premium textured cardstock, the kind of paper that costs a fortune just to print and mail. My name was written on the front in elegant gold calligraphy. I opened the envelope and pulled out a sleek, glossy invitation to the luxury real estate auction gala. It was hosted by the brokerage firm with Paige featured prominently as the lead executive director of the event. But it was not the printed invitation that caught my attention. It was the small handwritten note tucked inside the fold. I recognized her handwriting immediately. It was sharp and aggressive. I read the words she had written to me, and I felt a cold calm wash over my entire body. She wrote, "Come see how successful people actually live, old man. There is free food, so you do not have to worry about your grocery bill this week." The sheer hubris of that note was absolutely staggering. Here was a woman who was drowning in $2 million of dirty syndicate debt, whose luxury cars had just been repossessed in the dead of night, whose credit score was completely zeroed out, and she was still taking the time to mock a 75-year-old man. She wanted to parade her perceived superiority one last time. She wanted me to stand in the back of a glittering ballroom in my faded flannel shirt and watch her command the attention of the city elite. She wanted to rub my face in her fake wealth to prove that no matter what happened, she was better than me. She wanted to remind me of my place in her twisted racial and classist hierarchy. She thought I was just a ghetto carpenter who would be dazzled by sparkling chandeliers and expensive champagne. She thought I would cower in the presence of her wealthy white investors. She invited me because she needed a victim to witness her supposed triumph. She needed to look down on me to make herself feel tall. She had spent years dropping subtle insults about my neighborhood, my clothes, and my speech. This invitation was her ultimate insult, a final slap in the face before she thought she was going to sail away into the sunset with her stolen millions. I did not tear the note up. I did not throw it in the trash. I placed it gently on my kitchen table and smoothed out the creases. I looked at the gold lettering on the invitation, and I realized that Paige had just handed me the absolute perfect stage for her own execution. She wanted an audience. She wanted a grand spectacle. She wanted the wealthiest and most powerful people in the city to watch her operate. She had spent weeks trying to destroy my life in the shadows, burying drugs in my fishing gear, forging my signature on secret documents, and planning to lock me inside a psychiatric ward where no one could hear me scream. But I was not going to destroy her in the shadows. I was going to do it under the brightest lights in the city. I picked up my secure phone and called Malcolm. I told him I had just received a very special invitation and that we were going to accept it. I told him to contact the chief executive officer of the brokerage firm, the man who technically worked for my blind trust, and tell him to prepare his final statements. I told Malcolm to coordinate with the federal authorities and have them waiting quietly in the wings. Paige had set the stage and gathered the crowd, but I was going to be the one directing the final act of this play. I walked into my master bedroom and opened the very back of my closet. Past the worn denim jackets and the faded flannel shirts, I pulled out a heavy garment bag that I had not opened in years. Evelyn had bought this for me a long time ago for a massive corporate gala we attended in secret back when we were aggressively expanding our supply chain empire. It was a bespoke tailored suit crafted by one of the finest designers in the world. The dark wool was flawless. The cut was immaculate, and it radiated a kind of quiet, untouchable power. It was the armor of a man who owned empires, not the uniform of a retired handyman. I brushed my hand over the dark, luxurious fabric, remembering the way Evelyn smiled at me when I first put it on. She always told me that a man should never have to shout to prove he is in charge. True power, she said, speaks in a whisper. Paige wanted to see how successful people actually live. She wanted me to witness her grand hustle and feel small in her presence. I was going to give her exactly what she asked for. I was going to walk into her glittering ballroom and show her what real wealth and real power actually look like. But it was going to be the absolute last thing she ever saw as a free woman. I laid the suit out on my bed, turning off the bedroom light. Tomorrow night, the world Paige thought she controlled was going to burn to the ground, and I was going to be the one holding the match. The grand ballroom at the Plaza Hotel was a masterpiece of extravagant wealth and carefully constructed illusions. Crystal chandeliers hung from the soaring ceilings, casting a warm golden light over the polished marble floors. A live string quartet played soft classical music in the corner, providing the perfect sophisticated soundtrack for the city elite to gather and flaunt their money. This was exactly the kind of environment where Paige thrived. She was in her element, surrounded by billionaires, wealthy developers, and high society investors. I knew exactly what she was doing in that room. She was working the crowd wearing a stunning emerald green gown that she probably bought with the last few dollars of stolen credit she had left before I froze her accounts. She was smiling, laughing, and sipping expensive champagne, acting as if she owned the entire world. She was desperately pitching her fraudulent commercial real estate project to anyone who would listen, hoping to collect enough deposit checks tonight to pay off the violent underground syndicate that was actively hunting her and my son. She believed she was a master manipulator. She believed she was untouchable. Miles away from that glittering ballroom, I was standing in front of the full-length mirror in my quiet master bedroom. I ran my hands over the dark, luxurious wool of the bespoke $5,000 Tom Ford suit I had pulled from the back of my closet. I adjusted the crisp white collar of my shirt and fastened the platinum cufflinks Evelyn had given me for our 20th wedding anniversary. When I looked at my reflection, I did not see the tired, retired carpenter in faded flannel shirts. I did not see the vulnerable old man that my son and his wife tried to lock inside a psychiatric ward. I saw the man who had built a regional supply empire from absolutely nothing. I saw the shadow founder of a massive corporate conglomerate. I saw real power. I walked out of my historic home and stepped into the back of the sleek black luxury sedan that Malcolm had waiting in the driveway. The ride to the downtown plaza was perfectly silent. I watched the city lights blur past the tinted windows. I had spent decades hiding my wealth to protect my family from greed, but tonight I was using that wealth as a weapon of absolute destruction. Back in the ballroom, the auction presentation was about to begin. Paige was standing near the front of the stage holding her crystal champagne flute. She was surrounded by a group of wealthy older men laughing at their terrible jokes and projecting an image of absolute financial security. She probably looked toward the main entrance every few minutes, expecting to see me shuffle in, wearing my worn-out work boots and looking completely lost in the glamorous setting. She wanted me to feel small. She wanted to look down from her imaginary throne and pity the ignorant old black man who was about to lose his house to foreclosure. She wanted to feed her massive ego one last time before she took the investors' money and ran. But she was severely underestimating the storm that was gathering just outside those heavy mahogany double doors. I stood in the grand foyer of the Plaza Hotel. The thick mahogany doors leading into the ballroom towered in front of me. Malcolm stood to my left, holding a slim leather briefcase that contained the forensic audit, the forged mortgage documents, and the federal warrants. To my right stood Richard Sterling. Richard is the billionaire chief executive officer of the massive real estate brokerage firm where Paige worked as a vice president. Richard is a man who commands fear and respect in the corporate world. He is ruthless and incredibly powerful. But Richard knows exactly who signs his paychecks. He knows that my blind trust is the majority shareholder of his entire corporation. He knows that I am his ultimate boss. Richard looked at me and gave a deep, respectful nod, indicating that everything was ready. I did not smile. I simply reached out and pushed the heavy wooden doors open. The entrance was not loud, but it was commanding. When the massive doors swung open, the golden light from the chandeliers spilled out into the foyer. I stepped into the ballroom. I did not walk like a fragile old man carrying the weight of the world. I walked with the slow, measured, heavy steps of a king reclaiming his territory. The $5,000 Tom Ford suit draped perfectly over my shoulders, radiating a quiet but undeniable authority. People near the entrance immediately stopped talking. The silence began to ripple through the massive room like a physical wave. Wealthy investors and corporate titans turned their heads to see who had just arrived, causing such a sudden shift in the atmosphere. They saw a tall, strong black man dressed in immaculate tailoring, radiating absolute power. But what caught their attention even more was the entourage flanking me. The elite crowd immediately recognized Richard Sterling. They knew the billionaire chief executive officer of the most powerful brokerage in the state, but they were absolutely shocked by his body language. Richard was not walking ahead of me. He was not acting like the most important man in the room. He was walking slightly behind me, matching my pace, treating me with a level of extreme deference and respect that none of them had ever seen him display toward anyone. He was gesturing politely, guiding me through the crowd, parting the sea of wealthy investors to make a clear path for me. Malcolm walked on my other side, his sharp, analytical eyes scanning the room like a hawk looking for its prey. The guests began to whisper. You could hear the hushed, confused voices spreading through the ballroom. They were wondering who this incredibly powerful man was. They were wondering why the ruthless billionaire chief executive officer was acting like a humble subordinate to me. Across the room near the front stage, Paige was right in the middle of a fake laugh. She was holding her champagne flute and charming a group of potential victims for her fraudulent scheme. But the sudden shift in the energy of the room made her turn her head. She looked toward the grand entrance, expecting to see another wealthy target to manipulate. Instead, her eyes locked directly onto me. I saw the exact moment her brain tried to process what she was seeing. At first, there was only deep confusion. She saw a powerful, wealthy man in a bespoke suit walking through the crowd. Then the recognition hit her like a freight train. She realized the man in the $5,000 suit was Lloyd Daniels, her useless ghetto father-in-law, the retired carpenter she had relentlessly mocked and insulted, the man she was actively trying to lock in a psychiatric ward so she could steal his house and pay off her loan sharks. Her mouth fell open slightly. She blinked her eyes rapidly as if she were trying to wake up from a bizarre hallucination. But it was not a hallucination. It was reality crashing down on her fake world with the force of an avalanche. Then her eyes shifted to the right. She saw Richard Sterling. She saw the billionaire chief executive officer of her own company, the man she worshipped and feared, the man who held her entire career and her frozen corporate commissions in the palm of his hand. She saw Richard lean in and whisper something respectfully into my ear. She saw me give a slight authoritative nod in response. The color completely drained from her face. I watched the arrogant flush of her cheeks turn to an ashen, sickly gray. Her carefully constructed facade shattered into a million invisible pieces. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her trembling fingers. It hit the polished marble floor and shattered with a sharp, loud crash that echoed in the sudden quiet of her immediate circle. Champagne splashed across the hem of her expensive emerald green gown, but she did not even look down. She could not look away from me. Her chest began to heave as she struggled to breathe. Her eyes were wide with pure, absolute, unadulterated terror. She finally understood. She looked at my suit. She looked at my lawyer. She looked at her billionaire boss treating me like royalty. The puzzle pieces violently slammed together in her mind. She realized that the internal audit, the frozen corporate accounts, the sudden repossession of her luxury vehicles, and the complete destruction of her credit score were not just a string of incredibly bad luck. She realized that the universe was not punishing her. I was punishing her. I did not stop walking. I moved steadily through the parted crowd, my eyes locked completely onto hers. The wealthy investors stepped aside, giving me a wide berth, intimidated by the sheer gravity of my presence. Malcolm and Richard flanked me, perfectly sealing off any potential escape route she might have imagined. I was bringing the full weight of my empire straight to her feet. She had sent me a mocking invitation to this gala to see how successful people actually live. She wanted to humiliate me. She wanted to put me in my proper place. But she had just invited the executioner to her own public hanging. I watched her hands shake. I watched her look around the room, desperately realizing that she was completely trapped. The underground loan sharks were waiting for her outside, but the real monster was walking right toward her inside the ballroom. I stopped just a few feet away from her. The group of investors she had been charming slowly backed away, sensing the dangerous shift in the atmosphere. The string quartet in the corner seemed to fade into complete silence. Paige was trembling so violently I thought she might collapse right there in her ruined gown. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. There was no sweet daughter-in-law act left to play. There were no racial microaggressions left to hurl. There was only the suffocating, crushing realization that she had picked a fight with a man who owned the very ground she was standing on. I stood tall in my Tom Ford suit, looking down at the woman who tried to destroy my family. I did not need to raise my voice. The silence in the room was deafening enough. The final act was ready to begin, and there was absolutely nowhere left for her to run. The shattered glass from Paige dropping her champagne flute was quickly swept away by a hotel staff member. She tried to recover her composure, smoothing out the front of her expensive emerald green gown. She forced a stiff, rigid smile onto her face and turned away from me. She walked toward the grand stage set up at the front of the ballroom. She had a desperate mission to complete. She needed to pitch her fraudulent commercial real estate project to the wealthy investors in this room. She needed their deposit checks tonight to pay off the violent underground syndicate that was actively hunting her and my son. She climbed the short carpeted steps to the stage. She walked over to the sleek acrylic podium and tapped the microphone. A soft thud echoed through the massive room, drawing the attention of the city elite. The wealthy developers and billionaire investors slowly turned their attention to the stage. They held their expensive drinks and waited to hear what she had to say. The massive projector screen behind her lit up with beautiful high-definition architectural renderings of a luxury retail plaza. It looked incredibly professional and entirely legitimate. Paige took a deep breath and began her presentation. Her voice trembled slightly on the first few words, but she quickly forced herself into her practiced corporate rhythm. She spun a magnificent web of absolute lies. She talked about emerging markets and guaranteed returns on investment. She threw around massive financial projections and promised the audience that this was the most exclusive opportunity of the decade. She was literally begging for her life, masked behind corporate buzzwords and a fake smile. I stood at the back of the ballroom, flanked by Malcolm and Richard Sterling. I watched her lie to a room full of powerful people. I watched her use the very same deceptive charm she had used for years to belittle me and manipulate my son. She thought she was so incredibly smart. She thought she could hustle millions of dollars in a single night and walk away completely clean. But I could see the tiny beads of sweat forming on her neck. I could see the way her hands gripped the sides of the podium as if it were the only thing keeping her from collapsing to the floor. She was terrified. She knew I was standing in the back of the room watching her every move. She knew Richard Sterling, the billionaire chief executive officer of her brokerage firm, was standing right next to me. She was desperately trying to finish her pitch before her entire world burned down. I did not let her finish. I began to walk down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. The thick dark wool of my bespoke Tom Ford suit moved perfectly with every slow, measured step I took. The crowd of wealthy investors naturally parted, forming a wide, clear path for me. They did not know exactly who I was, but they could feel the undeniable weight of my presence. They saw Malcolm walking a few paces behind me, carrying his heavy leather briefcase. They saw Richard Sterling watching me with absolute deference. The whispers in the room completely stopped. The only sound was the steady, heavy rhythm of my leather shoes stepping onto the polished marble floor. Paige saw me walking down the aisle. She stopped speaking right in the middle of a sentence about projected quarterly profits. The microphone picked up her sharp intake of breath. She stared at me, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated panic. She wanted to run, but her legs were completely frozen. She was trapped on that brightly lit stage in front of hundreds of the most powerful people in the city. I reached the front of the room and slowly walked up the carpeted stairs of the stage. I stepped right up to the podium. I stood incredibly close to her. She was trembling so violently that the acrylic podium was actually shaking. I looked down at her pale, terrified face. I did not yell. I did not show an ounce of anger or aggression. True power never has to raise its voice. I simply reached out my hand and gently took the microphone from her trembling fingers. She did not resist. She let go of the microphone and took a small, weak step backward. Her arrogant facade was entirely gone. She was just a frightened little girl standing in the ruins of her own arrogance. I turned to face the audience of billionaires and elite developers. I looked out over the sea of expensive suits and glittering dresses. I spoke into the microphone and my voice echoed deep and calm through the massive ballroom. "Good evening," I said, letting the silence settle over the room. "My name is Lloyd Daniels. Many of you do not know my face, but you definitely know my company. I am the majority shareholder and the shadow founder of the corporate trust that owns the very brokerage hosting this event tonight." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. I saw several high-profile investors widen their eyes in absolute shock. They turned to look at Richard Sterling, who stood near the front row, and gave a slow, confirming nod. The room went completely still. They realized they were standing in the presence of a ghost, a man who had controlled the regional supply chains and commercial real estate markets from the shadows for over 40 years. I continued speaking, my voice steady and unwavering. "I came here tonight because the woman standing behind me invited me. She is my daughter-in-law. She invited me here to show an ignorant old retired carpenter how successful people actually live. She wanted me to witness her grand presentation. But the project she just pitched to you is a complete fabrication. It is a desperate illusion designed to steal your investment capital." I turned my head slightly and nodded toward the back of the room. Malcolm was standing near the technical control booth. He relayed the signal to the sound and lighting engineers. The massive high-definition projector screen behind Paige suddenly flickered. The beautiful architectural renderings of her fake retail plaza completely vanished. In their place, a massive, highly detailed forensic audit appeared on the screen. The numbers were staggering. The text was highlighted in bright warning red. I pointed to the screen and explained exactly what they were looking at. I told the audience of investors that the documents displayed behind me were the results of a federal-level corporate audit initiated just hours ago. The screen showed the offshore holding companies. It showed the illicit wire transfers. It showed the exact trail of corporate embezzlement Paige had committed to cover her failing investments. Then the screen shifted to a new document. It was the forged secondary mortgage on my historic home. The crowd stared at the $500,000 loan agreement and the sloppy imitation of my signature at the bottom. I spoke into the microphone and told the room that Paige and my son Kendrick had forged my name to borrow $500,000. I told them that Paige had leveraged herself into a $2 million debt with a violent underground syndicate. I explained that she was standing on this stage tonight begging for their investment checks so she could pay off loan sharks before they ended her life. The wealthy elite in the audience began to murmur in absolute horror. People started setting their champagne glasses down on the tables. They were looking at Paige with pure disgust. In their world, losing money is a mistake, but committing blatant corporate fraud and bringing violent criminals into their business circles is an unforgivable sin. Paige stood frozen on the stage, her face entirely drained of blood. She was staring at the massive screen displaying her own criminal footprint for the entire city to see. But I was not finished. The financial documents were just the beginning. I reached into the breast pocket of my tailored suit and pulled out the sleek silver recording pen. I held it up for the audience to see. I told the room that stealing money was one thing, but what my son and his wife planned to do to me to escape their debts was something entirely different. I told them that the pen in my hand had captured a conversation that took place in my own living room. I nodded to the tech booth one final time. Malcolm had already given the audio file to the engineers. The heavy silence in the ballroom was suddenly broken by the crystal-clear audio playing over the massive surround sound speakers. It was the recording from my living room. The voices of Kendrick and Paige echoed loudly for everyone to hear. The audience heard Paige crying her fake tears. They heard Kendrick spinning his wild lies about corporate enemies and planted drugs. They heard Kendrick begging me to sign the power of attorney documents. They heard Paige offering me her luxury pen, pushing an old man to sign away his entire estate. They heard the subtle, vicious threats about the police and the federal government. They heard the raw manipulation, the predatory coercion, and the absolute evil of two people trying to throw an elderly father into a psychiatric ward just to steal his home and save their own skins. The recording played for 3 agonizing minutes. Nobody in the ballroom moved a single muscle. The elite crowd stood completely paralyzed by the sheer depravity echoing through the speakers. They listened to Paige manipulate and threaten. They listened to the ugly, rotting core of her character broadcast at maximum volume. When the audio recording finally ended, the silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The wealthy investors stared at Paige with genuine revulsion. She had completely collapsed inward. She was hugging her own arms, her shoulders shaking violently as she stared down at the polished stage floor. She had nowhere to hide. Her fake wealth was gone. Her corporate reputation was entirely obliterated. Her criminal conspiracy was broadcast to the most powerful people in the state. I looked down at her. I did not feel any pity. I did not feel any regret. I held the microphone and spoke my final words to the silent, horrified room. I told them that this was what happens when arrogance outgrows intelligence. I told them that Paige wanted to show me how successful people live, but instead she just showed the entire world exactly how a criminal falls. I lowered the microphone and turned my back to her, leaving her entirely alone on the stage under the burning bright lights. The silence in the grand ballroom was so heavy, it felt like it could physically crush the breath right out of your lungs. I stood on the elevated stage and looked out at the vast sea of wealthy investors and corporate titans. Nobody moved a single muscle. Nobody dared to whisper a word. They just stared at Paige with absolute revulsion. She was no longer a rising star in the luxury real estate market. She was a massive liability. She was a walking criminal indictment broadcasting her own guilt under the bright stage lights. She stood there in her ruined emerald green gown, trembling so violently that her knees finally gave out beneath her. She dropped heavily to the polished wood floor of the stage, weeping openly, her hands desperately covering her face to hide her immense shame from the city elite. She had invited me here tonight to show me how successful people actually live. Instead, I was showing the entire city exactly how a greedy, manipulative criminal falls to pieces. I turned my head and looked toward the front row of the audience. Richard Sterling, the billionaire chief executive officer of the brokerage firm, adjusted his tailored suit jacket and began to walk toward the steps of the stage. The crowd quickly parted for him just as respectfully as they had parted for me. Richard is a man who built his massive reputation on being absolutely ruthless in the boardroom. He does not tolerate financial failure, and he certainly does not tolerate internal corporate theft. He walked up the carpeted stairs with heavy, deliberate steps. He did not even bother to look down at Paige as he walked right past her kneeling form. He treated her like a piece of garbage that someone had carelessly left on the floor. He walked straight up to me and stopped. He gave me a slow, respectful nod, acknowledging my absolute authority over his company, before turning to face the silent, horrified ballroom. I handed him the microphone. The very same microphone that Paige had used just minutes earlier to hustle millions of dollars in fraudulent investments was now the exact instrument of her total destruction. Richard took a deep breath. His voice boomed through the surround sound speakers, sharp and entirely devoid of mercy. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice slicing cleanly through the thick tension in the room. "What you have witnessed here tonight is a profound and disgusting betrayal of the ethical standards we hold at this firm. The woman weeping on the floor behind me was entrusted with millions of dollars in client assets. She was given unparalleled access to our corporate resources, and she chose to use that extreme privilege to orchestrate a massive criminal fraud." Paige let out a loud, gut-wrenching sob, but Richard did not even pause for a second to acknowledge her pain. He stared directly out at the crowd of powerful developers, ensuring that every single person in the room understood that the brokerage was cutting ties with her permanently and aggressively. Effective immediately, Richard announced, his voice echoing loudly off the crystal chandeliers. "Paige is permanently terminated from her position as vice president of this firm. She is completely stripped of all corporate titles, all administrative privileges, and all access to our client portfolios. You no longer work for this company, and you no longer have any legal protection under our corporate umbrella." Paige lifted her tear-stained face, looking up at Richard with sheer, unadulterated panic. "Richard, please," she begged, her voice cracking with pure desperation. "I can explain everything to you. I was going to pay it all back. I just needed a little more time to finalize the deals. Please do not do this to me. You know how incredibly hard I have worked for this company over the years." Richard looked down at her with eyes as cold as solid ice. "You do not get to explain anything to me," he said flatly, the microphone amplifying his disdain. "The internal forensic audit has already successfully traced every single unauthorized wire transfer you made to those violent underground holding companies. You stole directly from this firm to cover your pathetic gambling in the commercial sector. You brought the violent criminal underworld right to our corporate doorstep. Because of your highly illegal actions, the board of directors has officially voted to seize every single asset you currently hold." The crowd murmured in collective shock. Richard was completely dismantling her life piece by piece in front of everyone she desperately wanted to impress. He spoke directly into the microphone, explaining the devastating legal ramifications of her greedy choices. "Every dollar in your personal bank accounts, every piece of equity you currently hold, and every single commission you thought you earned is now the permanent property of this corporation until your massive stolen debts are paid in full." Richard declared loudly, "You have absolutely nothing left. And to ensure that you never defraud another innocent investor in this city or any other city, I have personally contacted the state licensing board tonight. Your real estate license is not just suspended, it is being permanently revoked. You will never legally sell another piece of property as long as you live." Paige let out a horrific, agonizing scream. It was the devastating sound of a woman watching her entire identity burn to ashes in real time. Her elevated status, her fake wealth, her prestigious career, and her arrogant pride were completely vaporized in front of the very people she worshipped. She curled into a tight defensive ball on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. The violent loan sharks were still waiting for her somewhere outside in the dark city, but she no longer had a single penny to her name. The corporate shield that had protected her toxic behavior for so long was permanently shattered into dust. While Paige was having her very public breakdown on the stage, my eyes were busy scanning the back of the massive ballroom. I knew my son better than anyone else in the world. I knew exactly how Kendrick operated when the pressure of consequence became too great. He was a fundamental coward. When the fire gets too hot, Kendrick does not stand his ground and fight. He abandons the ship and leaves everyone else to burn alive. Through the dim lighting near the grand entrance, I saw a familiar figure moving frantically through the dense crowd. It was Kendrick. He was sweating heavily through his expensive suit, pushing aggressively past the wealthy investors, trying desperately to reach the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the room. He had watched his own wife get publicly executed by her billionaire boss. He had heard his own treacherous voice playing over the massive speakers plotting to lock his elderly father in a psychiatric ward. He knew the police were coming and his only instinct was to run away. He thought he could just slip out into the dark night and disappear, leaving Paige to take the fall for the entire criminal enterprise. But he did not know that my razor-sharp attorney was already waiting for him. As Kendrick reached out a trembling hand to grab the brass handle of the exit doors, a large, imposing figure stepped out of the shadows and completely blocked his path. It was Malcolm. My lawyer stood incredibly tall and unmoving, his heavy leather briefcase resting casually by his side. Kendrick slammed right into Malcolm's chest, bouncing backward with a look of absolute terror washing over his sweating face. "Move!" Kendrick yelled, his voice shaking with raw, untamed panic. "Get out of my way, right now!" Malcolm did not flinch or step aside. He simply crossed his strong arms over his chest and looked down at my son with pure, unadulterated disgust. "You are not going anywhere," Kendrick Malcolm said, his voice low and incredibly dangerous. "The exits are fully secured and the federal authorities are currently pulling into the valet circle right outside those doors. You are going to stay right here and face the music." Kendrick looked around wildly like a trapped rat desperately searching for an open sewer drain. The wealthy guests standing near the back of the room quickly formed a tight circle around him, trapping him completely. They stared at him with utter revulsion. He was the man who tried to destroy his own elderly father for cash. He was the man who brought illicit narcotics and forged mortgages into their pristine world. There was absolutely no sympathy for him in that room. He was totally isolated, abandoned by the high society he had tried so desperately to impress for his entire adult life. I stepped forward to the very edge of the stage. The bright spotlight washed over my dark tailored suit, illuminating me far above the whispering crowd. I looked all the way across the massive ballroom directly into the terrified, wide eyes of my only son. The crowd respectfully parted down the center aisle, leaving a clear, unobstructed line of sight between the two of us. Kendrick looked up at me. His face was covered in a slick, cold sweat. His chest heaved with heavy, ragged breaths. He looked at the man he thought was a useless retired carpenter. He looked at the man he meticulously planned to lock inside a cage just to steal a historic home. I did not need a microphone for him to hear my next words. The room was so incredibly quiet that my voice carried effortlessly across the polished marble floor. "You thought you were so incredibly smart?" I said, my voice perfectly steady and completely unyielding. "You looked at my faded flannel shirts and my calloused hands, and you saw weakness. You saw an easy target. You thought you could just take my home and hand it over to violent criminals to save your own pathetic life. You thought you could manipulate the legal system and throw me away like yesterday garbage." Kendrick fell heavily to his knees right in the middle of the ballroom. His legs simply gave out beneath the crushing atmospheric weight of his ultimate failure. He started weeping, begging for mercy in front of the entire city elite. "Dad, please," he sobbed, his voice echoing pathetically off the crystal chandeliers. "I am so sorry. I was just desperate. Please help me. Please tell them to let me go. I will do absolutely anything." I looked down at him, feeling no pity and no regret whatsoever. The innocent boy I raised was long gone, replaced entirely by the greedy coward weeping on the floor. I delivered the final blow, letting the words ring out with absolute permanent finality. "You tried to steal a puddle, Kendrick, completely blind to the fact that I own the entire ocean." The heavy silence in the grand ballroom was suddenly shattered by a sound that cut through the thick tension like a sharp blade. It started as a faint wail in the distance, echoing down the busy city streets. Within seconds, the sound multiplied and grew deafeningly loud. The piercing shriek of multiple federal sirens surrounded the downtown Plaza Hotel. The flashing red and blue lights began to reflect off the massive glass windows of the ballroom, casting frantic, sweeping shadows across the polished marble floor. The wealthy investors and corporate titans in the room began to murmur nervously, looking toward the grand mahogany doors at the back of the hall. They knew exactly what that sound meant. The finale of this highly orchestrated play had finally arrived. I stood completely still on the elevated stage, looking out over the sea of panicked faces. I did not move a single muscle. Malcolm stood by the exit doors, his arms crossed over his chest, his face a mask of absolute calm. He had arranged this precise moment perfectly. He had coordinated with his former colleagues at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, making sure they had every single piece of evidence they needed to secure airtight arrest warrants before the sun even went down today. The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom swung open with a violent crash. A dozen federal agents stormed into the glamorous room. They wore dark tactical jackets with bold letters across their backs. Their heavy boots stomped rhythmically against the pristine marble, completely disrupting the elegant atmosphere of the high society gala. The elite guests scrambled out of the way, pressing themselves against the walls, and the catered buffet tables terrified of being caught in the crossfire of a federal raid. The agents moved with ruthless military precision. They did not ask politely. They did not care about the expensive tailored suits or the designer gowns surrounding them. They had a specific target, and they moved directly toward the stage. Paige was still kneeling on the floor near the acrylic podium. Her emerald green gown was ruined, stained with spilled champagne and her own bitter tears. When she heard the heavy footsteps of the federal agents approaching the stage, she slowly lifted her head. The color had entirely drained from her face, leaving her looking like a hollow, empty shell of the arrogant woman she used to be. Two tall agents stepped up the short carpeted stairs and walked right up to her. They did not offer her a hand to help her stand. One of the agents looked down at her and spoke in a loud, authoritative voice that echoed through the entire ballroom. He stated her full legal name and told her she was under arrest by order of the federal government. He read off the list of her charges one by one, letting the heavy words sink into the minds of every wealthy investor in the room. He announced she was being charged with massive corporate wire fraud. He announced she was being charged with severe corporate embezzlement. He announced she was being charged with forging official bank documents and manipulating federal loan applications. Paige tried to shake her head. She tried to open her mouth to speak, to deny the allegations, to spin one last desperate lie, but she had absolutely no breath left in her lungs. The agent reached down and grabbed her by the arm, hauling her forcefully to her feet. He spun her around and pushed her hands behind her back. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly over the silent crowd. The sound was so final. It was the sound of her entire luxury lifestyle coming to a permanent crashing halt. The woman who had sent me a mocking invitation just yesterday, telling me to come see how successful people actually live, was now standing in front of her billionaire boss and her elite peers, bound in steel chains and completely humiliated. While Paige was being read her rights at the front of the room, another group of federal agents had already surrounded my son at the back. Kendrick was still kneeling on the floor, right where he had collapsed after trying to sneak out the exit doors. He was sweating profusely, sobbing uncontrollably, and pleading with Malcolm to let him go. But Malcolm simply stepped aside and let the federal authorities do their job. 3 agents descended upon my son. They grabbed him by the shoulders of his expensive suit and hauled him to his feet. Kendrick's legs were shaking so violently that the agents had to physically hold him up to keep him from collapsing back onto the marble floor. The lead agent looked him dead in the eyes and read his charges. The agent told him he was being placed under immediate arrest for severely violating the conditions of his active bail. He told Kendrick he was being charged with aggravated identity theft for using my social security number to open fraudulent credit lines. And finally, the agent announced the most devastating charge of them all. He told Kendrick he was being indicted for federal drug conspiracy. Kendrick let out a loud, pathetic wail. He begged the agents to listen to him. He told them he was a respected finance director. He told them he lived in a gated community and that this was all a massive misunderstanding. He cried out that he was just trying to protect his family. But the agents did not care about his tears or his lies. They slammed his wrists together behind his back and locked the heavy handcuffs into place. The silver metal dug deep into his wrists. His perfectly tailored suit was rumpled and soaked in his own terrified sweat. The boy I had raised, the boy I had sacrificed my body to put through college, was now a common federal criminal weeping in front of the entire city elite. The agents began to march them out of the ballroom. They dragged Paige down from the stage and led her up the center aisle. At the exact same time, the agents at the back of the room marched Kendrick forward. They met right in the middle of the grand ballroom, directly beneath a massive glittering crystal chandelier. It was the exact spot where they were supposed to be celebrating their fraudulent real estate project. Instead, it became the stage for their ultimate mutual destruction. When Paige and Kendrick saw each other bound in steel chains, surrounded by federal agents, the final remaining shreds of their marriage completely vaporized. The immense pressure of the financial chokehold, the terror of the violent underground syndicate, and the reality of a long federal prison sentence finally broke them. They did not look at each other with love or support. They looked at each other with pure, unadulterated hatred. They were two cornered animals, and their only instinct was to tear the other one to pieces in a desperate, pathetic attempt to save themselves. Paige lunged toward Kendrick, her eyes wide and wild. She screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking and echoing off the high ceilings. She yelled to the federal agents that Kendrick was a useless, pathetic coward. She screamed that he was the one who forced her to forge the mortgage documents. She told the authorities that he had threatened her and manipulated her into stealing from the corporation because he was too weak and too stupid to pay off his own debts. She cried out that she was just a victim of his financial incompetence and that she never wanted to hurt anyone. She threw her husband completely under the bus without a single second of hesitation, hoping that her fake tears would buy her an ounce of sympathy from the federal government. Kendrick did not stay silent. The betrayal in his wife's voice ignited a furious, desperate rage inside him. He strained against the grip of the federal agents and screamed right back at her. He yelled to the entire room that Paige was a manipulative, greedy monster. He shouted to the agents that Paige was the absolute mastermind behind the entire drug conspiracy. He told them that she was the one who bought the narcotics from the underground syndicate, and that she was the one who forced him to plant the heavy black bag in my fishing gear. He screamed that she wanted to lock me in a psychiatric ward so she could steal my historic home and pay off her terrible commercial real estate investments. He told the agents she was a liar, a thief, and the sole reason their lives were completely destroyed. They stood there in the middle of the glamorous ballroom screaming vicious insults and exposing every single dirty secret they had ever kept. They confessed to their crimes right in front of the billionaire investors, the corporate executives, and the federal authorities. They traded their loyalty for a desperate chance at a plea deal. The wealthy crowd watched in absolute disgust as the polished power couple revealed themselves to be nothing more than petty, treacherous criminals willing to destroy each other for a lighter prison sentence. I stood on the elevated stage and watched them tear each other apart. I did not feel a single drop of sorrow. I did not feel any regret. I watched the agents finally pull them apart, forcefully shoving them toward the grand mahogany exit doors. Paige was sobbing and screaming curses at her husband. Kendrick was crying and begging the agents to listen to his side of the story. They were dragged out of the ballroom, their voices fading as the heavy doors swung shut behind them, leaving the room in a state of stunned, heavy silence. I slowly walked down the carpeted stairs of the stage. The wealthy investors parted for me, keeping their heads bowed in absolute respect and profound fear. I walked out of the ballroom and into the grand foyer of the hotel. Malcolm was waiting for me near the front entrance, his heavy leather briefcase resting casually by his side. We walked out through the revolving glass doors and stepped into the cool, crisp night air. The street in front of the Plaza Hotel was lined with federal vehicles. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the dark city sidewalks. I stood on the top step and watched as the agents shoved Paige into the back of one squad car. She was still weeping, her expensive gown completely ruined, pressing her face against the cold glass of the window. A few feet away, they shoved Kendrick into the back of a separate squad car. He was staring out at me, his eyes wide and hollow, completely broken. They were going to separate federal holding facilities. They were going to face trials, prison sentences, and the absolute destruction of everything they ever valued. The violent underground syndicate would never get their $2 million, and they would likely seize whatever remaining assets the government missed. Kendrick and Paige had tried to bury me. They had tried to strip me of my home, my freedom, and my dignity. But in the end, they only succeeded in building their own permanent cages. I watched the squad cars pull away from the curb, their sirens wailing as they disappeared into the dark city night. The street grew quiet again. The cool wind brushed against the dark wool of my bespoke suit. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the clean, fresh air of absolute victory. Malcolm looked at me and gave a slow, respectful nod. The invisible war was finally over. The tumors had been permanently removed from my life. I walked toward the sleek, black, luxury sedan waiting for me at the curb, ready to go back to my historic home and sleep in absolute perfect peace. Exactly 365 days have passed since the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the polished marble floor of that grand ballroom. Today, the only light reflecting into my eyes is the bright golden sun bouncing off the deep blue waters of the Atlantic Ocean. I am sitting in a comfortable leather chair on the polished teak deck of my private yacht. The air out here is salty and incredibly peaceful. It fills my lungs with a clean, pure energy that you can never find in the crowded city streets. There are no sirens out here. There are no desperate people begging for money or trying to forge signatures on secret documents. There is just the gentle, rhythmic rocking of the boat and the endless stretch of open water in front of me. I hold my custom carbon fiber fishing rod in my calloused hands, feeling the smooth tension of the heavy line dipping deep into the ocean. A year ago, my Sunday morning fishing trip was violently interrupted by a greedy son trying to bury a bag of illicit narcotics in my tackle box. Today, nobody is interrupting my peace. My secure mobile phone buzzes softly on the small glass table next to my chair. I do not rush to pick it up. I take my time, reeling in my line just a few inches before I reach over and press the green button. It is Malcolm. His voice comes through the speaker clear and sharp, cutting through the sound of the ocean breeze. Malcolm does not call me for idle chat. When he calls, it means a chapter is officially closing. He tells me that he just walked out of the federal courthouse downtown. The final sentencing hearings have officially concluded. The justice system moves incredibly slow, but when it finally arrives, it hits with the crushing weight of a falling mountain. Malcolm reads me the official verdicts, and I listen to the absolute destruction of the two people who tried to throw my life away. Paige took a plea deal, Malcolm tells me, his tone echoing with profound professional satisfaction. She tried to fight the federal prosecutors for months, but when they laid out the mountain of forensic evidence proving massive corporate wire fraud and illegal syndication, she completely broke. She knew she would lose a public trial and face decades behind bars. She took the deal. The federal judge sentenced her to 8 years in a maximum security federal prison. 8 years. She is stripped of her designer gowns, her luxury sports cars, and her arrogant pride. She will spend the next 8 years of her life wearing a standard-issue uniform surrounded by concrete walls, completely isolated from the wealthy high society she worshipped. The violent underground loan sharks cannot reach her inside the federal facility, but the crushing reality of her absolute failure will haunt her every single day. She wanted to show me how successful people live. Now she will learn exactly how federal inmates survive. Malcolm moves on to my son. Kendrick did not fare much better. He tried to throw his wife under the bus to save his own skin, but the federal drug conspiracy charges and the identity theft violations were entirely undeniable. The judge sentenced him to 5 years in federal prison. 5 years for the boy I raised. 5 years for the man who looked me in the eyes and lied while trying to steal the roof over my head. I look out at the vast ocean and I feel absolutely nothing for him. No sorrow, no regret. He chose his path the moment he decided that my life was worth less than his debts. He is no longer my son. He is just another consequence of unchecked greed. But Malcolm saves the best news for last. He tells me about the massive 6-bedroom mansion in the gated suburban community, the house that Kendrick and Paige used to project their fake wealth. Because they were locked away and their accounts were completely frozen, the property went into immediate foreclosure. The bank seized it to recoup their losses. But the bank did not hold it for long. Malcolm explains that one of my anonymous corporate holding companies stepped in and purchased the foreclosed property entirely in cash. We bought their grand mansion for a fraction of its original price. I smile as Malcolm details the architectural plans we submitted to the city council. We are not going to sell that massive house to another arrogant, wealthy couple. We are gutting the interior. We are turning that monument of greed into a fully funded community youth center for underprivileged children from the inner city. The very same children that Paige would have looked down upon with absolute disgust will now be running through her grand hallways, learning how to read using computers, and building legitimate futures. Evelyn would have loved that. My late wife always believed that the best way to destroy evil is to plant something good directly on top of its grave. I thank Malcolm for his exceptional work. I tell him to take a long, well-deserved vacation, and I disconnect the call. I set the phone face down on the glass table. I reach over and pick up a heavy crystal glass filled with top-shelf aged bourbon. The amber liquid catches the sunlight as I bring it to my lips. I take a slow, deep sip, letting the rich, warm flavor burn smoothly down my throat. It tastes like absolute victory. It tastes like survival. I look down at my calloused hands, the hands that built an empire from dirt and sweat. They tried to tell me I was a useless ghetto carpenter. They tried to make me a victim. They tried to make me a burden. They made me a target. But I am not a victim. I am not a burden. I am the man who restored order. I am the man who protected the legacy. Suddenly I feel a sharp, heavy tug on my fishing line. The carbon fiber rod bends deeply toward the deep blue water. I do not panic. I do not rush. I plant my feet firmly on the wooden deck and I begin to reel it in smoothly and steadily. I control the tension. I control the pace. I smile as I secure my catch, pulling it from the depths of the ocean. I bait the hook one more time and I cast the heavy line far out into the endless, beautiful water. The world is perfectly quiet again as the screen fades to black. The greatest lesson in this life is that true power never has to shout to be heard. Greed is a blinding disease that makes people underestimate the quiet strength of those they deem weak. When you measure a person by the clothes they wear or the age in their bones, you make the most fatal mistake of your life. Respect is not something you can buy with borrowed money, and loyalty is not something you can forge on a document. Always remember that the people who sit in silence are usually the ones holding all the cards. If you believe that karma always collects its debts, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below.